Chapter 2206. Shaochen was deliberately speeding up the pace of the war and quickly consuming the various resources of Heavenly Sect. Yang Chen was well aware of this, but there was nothing he could do about it. After the war, Heavenly Sect was forced to consume a lot of healing elixirs. Seeing that the elixirs were becoming more and more scarce, Yang Chen's mood became heavier and heavier. In the Great Thousand World, the force that had the most healing elixirs was undoubtedly Dan Valley. However, Dan Valley was obviously on the side of the Sword Sect, so it was impossible for them to sell healing elixirs to Heavenly Sect. In addition, Heavenly Sect did not have many spirit stones, so it was even more impossible for them to buy on credit. They could only buy from other forces, but this all required money. Because of the destruction of the spiritual vein plane, Heavenly Sect did not have many spirit stones. After agreeing to distribute the healing elixirs, Yang Chen kept thinking about how to deal with it. However, no matter how hard Yang Chen racked his brains, the current situation seemed to have completely fallen into a deadlock, and there was no way to solve it. Yang Chen could not think of any way to solve it. On the other side, after another war, Shaochen immediately ordered people to distribute healing elixirs. Then, he discussed the next move with Zhang Xing and the others. In the face of the current advantage held by the Sword Sect, everyone was full of confidence at this moment. Shaochen did not hide anything from them, and truthfully told them about the message he had sent to Long Qing. The reinforcements from Dragon Palace will probably arrive soon, but before that, I want to consume as many healing elixirs as possible in the Heavenly Sect's hands. In this way, we can take them down in one fell swoop. After Long Qing finished dealing with the internal affairs of Dragon Palace, he could lead people to provide reinforcements. However, before that, Shaochen had to continue to speed up the pace of the war and completely consume the few healing elixirs in the Heavenly Sect's hands. Hearing Shaochen's words, Zhang Xing and the other deputy sect leaders nodded in agreement. Indeed, without healing pills, it would be much easier to take down the Heavenly Sect. Everyone agreed with Shaochen's idea. In response, Shaochen gave the order for the Sword Sect to recover as quickly as possible without worrying about using up their healing pills. They would attack the Heavenly Merging Sect again in 3 days. Shaochen shortened the time between battles to 3 days. Without sufficient healing pills, it was impossible to recover from injuries in 3 days. However, the Sword Sect had no shortage of healing pills. Not to mention the Sword Sect's own reserves, even the Dan Valley had been supplying the Sword Sect with all kinds of pills. With the support of the Dan Valley, Shaochen was naturally very confident. Therefore, he was not stingy with the distribution of healing pills. Everyone could get enough healing pills. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. After 3 days, Shaochen once again led the Sword Sect to attack the Heavenly Sect. In response, Yang Chen was forced to fight again. After a great battle, there was still no clear winner between the two sides. They both retreated and began to heal. However, it was obvious that Shaochen was shortening the time he had to rest. 2 days later, the Swords Gate launched another attack, not giving the Heavenly Gate any time to rest. Such fierce and frequent battles made it more and more difficult for the Heavenly Sect to bear. In particular, the healing pills were completely insufficient at this time. Many of the ordinary disciples of the Heavenly Sect were no longer allocated any healing pills after the battle. Only the higher-ups of the Heavenly Sect were able to get some healing pills in small quantities. Without enough healing pills as support, the injured disciples of the Heavenly Sect could not recover in the shortest time possible. Moreover, the Sword Sect's attacks were becoming more frequent. As a result, it was a vicious cycle. Before their injuries were healed, they had to go back to battle. This obviously caused the death rate of the Heavenly Sect to be much higher than that of the Sword Sect. This change was very obvious. With the shortage of healing pills and the increasing frequency of the Sword Sect's attacks, the death rate of the Heavenly Sect was also becoming more and more serious. Some of the disciples of the Heavenly Sect who were already injured but had to fight with injuries almost never returned. Because they were already injured, they naturally could not be a match for the disciples of the Sword Sect. Not only was the death rate increasing, but the morale of the disciples of the Heavenly Sect was also declining. Moreover, at this time, Longqing led the experts of Dragon Palace and finally arrived at the Sword Sect's encampment. This time, although Longqing only brought some experts of Dragon Palace, and even Long Yuan did not come in person, the support of Dragon Palace was like the straw that broke the camel's back. The Heavenly Sect was already at a disadvantage. Now that they had to face the threat of the experts of Dragon Palace, the Heavenly Sect was even more powerless to resist. The brother and sister had not seen each other for a long time. Xiaochen was naturally very happy to see Longqing again. Naturally, he was very happy to see Longqing again. In the simple wooden house where they lived, Xiaochen and Longqing sat opposite each other, drinking and chatting. Seeing that Longqing's injuries had healed, Xiaochen was completely relieved. At the same time, Longqing also asked about Xin Yuanling's whereabouts. In this regard, Xiaochen did not hide anything and told the truth. Big brother went out to practice alone. Xin Yuanling left the Sword Sect alone. Although there was no news for a long time, his life token was intact. Obviously, there was no problem. Longqing secretly heaved a sigh of relief when he heard this. The arrival of Longqing also made Xiaochen ready to launch a fatal blow to the Heavenly Sect. With the cooperation of the experts of Dragon Palace, it was not impossible to defeat the Heavenly Sect in one battle. Compared with the confidence of Xiaochen's side, Tao Ming and Yang Chen sat opposite each other on the Heavenly Sect's side. Yang Chen's eyes were full of unwillingness and hatred, but Tao Ming still said calmly, "It's time to prepare. Some things can't be forced." Tao Ming obviously already knew that the general trend was irreversible. In the current situation, it was obviously impossible for the Heavenly Sect to compete with the Sword Sect. It was time to consider a way out. But in this regard, Yang Chen was silent and did not say a word. Yang Chen was unwilling to admit defeat like this, absolutely unwilling. But if he did not admit defeat, what else could he do? Yang Chen was already unable to cope with the Sword Sect alone. Now that Longqing had arrived with a group of experts of Dragon Palace, he had no chance of winning. While Yang Chen and Tao Ming were extremely unwilling, an elder of the Heavenly Sect quickly walked in and spoke to Yang Chen and Tao Ming with a strange expression. "Sect Master, Ancestor, an elder of Dragon Palace came to visit. He said that he has something important to discuss with you. Please collect, vote, recommend." End of chapter. Chapter 2207. Dragon Palace? Hearing the elder's words, Tao Ming and Yang Chen looked at each other and saw a trace of doubt in each other's eyes. Given the current position of Dragon Palace, how could an elder of Dragon Palace come to visit us? Dragon Palace? Hearing the elder's words, Tao Ming and Yang Chen looked at each other and saw a trace of doubt in each other's eyes. Given the current position of Dragon Palace, how could an elder of Dragon Palace come to visit us? Moreover, it seemed that Xiaochen did not know that the elder had come. Yang Chen was puzzled, but after thinking about it, he said faintly, "Let him in." After thinking for a while, Yang Chen finally decided to meet the elder of Dragon Palace. But after a slight pause, Yang Chen suddenly added, "Well, take him to the secret room." For safety's sake, Yang Chen finally chose to meet the elder of Dragon Palace in the secret room to avoid unnecessary trouble. No one knew what the elder of Dragon Palace said to Yang Chen and Tao Ming. No one even knew that the three of them had met. At this time, Xiaochen was planning to launch the final attack on Etienne's sect. This attack would not directly destroy Etienne's sect, but it would at least tear apart Etienne's sect's direction and push the battlefield to Etienne Prefecture. After the previous few entanglements, there should not be many healing pills and resources left in the Etienne mansion. Moreover, without enough spirit stones, it would be difficult for the Etienne mansion to replenish in large quantities in a short period of time. Therefore, in Xiaochen's view, it was obviously time to launch the final attack and destroy Etienne's sect's defense line in one fell swoop. What's more, the Sword Sect now had the help of Dragon Palace, so their chances of winning were greater. Song Xing, Nangong Guan, Zhou Song, and even Jun Wuya had no objection to Xiaochen's decision. Since the beginning of the battle, the two sides had been entangled for a long time. It was time to determine the final winner. In order to ensure that nothing went wrong, Xiaochen also distributed all kinds of elixirs produced by the sword sect. Most of them were healing elixirs. Of course, there were some elixirs that could increase combat strength. Secondly, there were talismans. Xiaochen was not stingy. It was a feeling of cutting off all means of retreat. However, the current situation was obviously on the sword sect's side. If there were no accidents, sword sect would definitely win the battle. Even Mutian Mountain and Tianyin Tower, who stood on Etienne sect's side. They did not think that Etienne sect had any reason to win. There was simply no reason for Etienne sect to win. Within Mutian Mountain, Yun Qianni had just finished a day of training and was drinking tea and resting in the garden. In front of him, an elder of Mutian Mountain softly said, "Sect Master, do we really not need to help?" Elder asked the elder's mind Etienne sect's words. After all, anyone with a discerning eye could see that Etienne sect was at the edge of a cliff. Perhaps they would be defeated in the next battle. As one of the forces that had the best relationship with Etienne sect, Mutian Mountain should actually help at this time. However, Yun Qianni shook his head and said, "I want to help, but will Moon Palace and Dan Valley give me the chance?" Xiao, Dan Xian, these two guys haven't done anything yet. They are waiting for me. If the situation allowed it, Yun Qianni would definitely help. However, the current situation did not allow him to make any unusual moves. Moreover, Yun Qianni was very clear that with Etienne sect's current situation, even if Mutian Mountain helped, the final outcome would still be uncertain. Mutian Mountain might even be dragged into the quagmire. To put it bluntly, Yun Qianni was no longer optimistic about the Kadian sect in Yangchen. In Yun Qianni's opinion, the Kadian sect was bound to lose this time. There was no way they could reverse the situation, and there was no chance for them to make a comeback. Hence, it would be foolish of him to help Etienne sect even though he knew that they would be destroyed. As for the relationship between the two sects, it was nothing in the face of life and death. At least to Yun Qianni, it was nothing. As the sect leader of Mutian Mountain, Yun Qianni had to first ensure the prosperity of Mutian Mountain. Hence, Yun Qianni would only do things for the benefit of Mutian Mountain. Helping Etienne sect now would not only bring no benefits to Mutian Mountain, but it might even cause Mutian Mountain to sink into the quagmire and be unable to extricate themselves. Yun Qianni naturally would not do such a thing. He had already made up his mind to observe the situation and not interfere with the matters of the Heavenly Gate. Hearing Yun Qianni's words, the Mutian Mountain elder also understood Yun Qianni's intention. He nodded his head slightly and did not say anything else. Even Mutian Mountain, who had the closest relationship with Etienne sect, did not think highly of Etienne sect. It could be seen how awkward Etienne sect's current situation was. It could be said that Etienne sect was waiting for death. They were waiting for Xiaochen to give them the final fatal blow. Then, Etienne sect would announce their destruction. Xiaochen did not make Etienne sect wait for too long for this final fatal blow. 3 days later, when everyone in the sword sect had completely recovered, Xiaochen finally started to attack Etienne sect. In the sword sect base, Xiaochen, Jun Weiyuan, Long Qing, and the End Realm experts of the sword sect and Dragon Palace stood proudly in the sky. Under everyone's escort, Xiaochen's gaze slowly swept across everyone in the sword sect. He had a faint smile on his face and his eyes were filled with confidence as he shouted out, "Everyone, today is the day that our sword sect returns to the altar." In the past, our sword sect was one of the 10 great Lingtian sects. Today, our sword sect will return to its former glory. After being entangled with Etienne sect for so long, it's time to end it. Today is the day that we destroy Etienne sect. Destroy Etienne sect. Following Xiaochen's words, the disciples of the sword sect shouted out loudly. They naturally knew that the battle had reached such a stage. It could be said that victory was already set. The sword sect was only one step away from defeating Etienne sect. Thinking about how the sword sect could finally return to the altar after so many years and return to the ranks of the 10 great Lingtian sects, everyone in the sword sect was naturally excited. Returning to the ranks of the 10 great Ling Tian sects was the wish of everyone in Sword's Gate. It was also the goal that everyone had been pursuing all this while. Now, this goal was finally close at hand and within reach. Their fighting spirit was completely aroused. Hearing everyone's shouts, Xiaochen also shouted out in a deep voice, "Kill! Kill! Kill! Kill!" Following the shouts, the people of the Sword sect were like wild horses that had escaped their reins. They charged towards Hetian sect's base. The fighting spirit in their eyes was already extremely dense. It was as if in their eyes, Hetian sect was just a group of lambs waiting to be slaughtered. There was no need to fear them at all. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2208. There was no need for any tactics in this battle. Just from the comparison of the morale of both sides, the Heavenly Sect was completely crushed by the Sword Sect. Looking at the people of the Sword Sect who were charging towards the Heavenly Sect camp, they were all like wolves and tigers. It was as if they wished that they were too slow and others would beat them to it. Looking at the terrifying morale of the Sword Sect, Xiaochen smiled and said, "We will definitely win this battle." After speaking, he led the group towards the Heavenly Sect camp. Flying all the way, they quickly arrived at the Heavenly Sect camp. At the same time, the Heavenly Sect cultivators who were attacked by the Sword Sect all appeared to defend. However, what was strange was that there wasn't a single End Realm expert among the Heavenly Sect experts. Not to mention the End Realm, there wasn't even a single Comprehension Realm expert. After leading the group to the battlefield, Sangxing immediately saw that something was wrong. He whispered to Xiaochen, "Sect leader, there seems to be something wrong. Why hasn't a single Heavenly Sect expert appeared? They are all ordinary disciples." Looking out, there wasn't a single Heavenly Sect expert on the battlefield. Even Yang Chen and Tao Ming were nowhere to be seen. A strange glint flashed across his eyes. Without the protection of the many experts, the ordinary disciples of the Heavenly Union sect were naturally unable to withstand the attack of the Sword's Gate. Xiaochen and the others did not even need to make a move. The disciples of the Heavenly Union sect were defeated in a single blow, and many of them began to flee in secret. It could be said that they were defeated in one exchange. However, Xiaochen wasn't happy at all because the most important thing was that none of the Heavenly Sect experts were here. Did they run? Looking at the battle in front of him, Long Qing also guessed. If they didn't appear, then it was very likely that they ran. Hearing this, Xiaochen didn't reply because he wasn't sure where the Heavenly Sect experts went. Did they run because they knew that they weren't a match for the Sword Sect, or did they have some other scheme? Defeating these ordinary disciples didn't mean much to Xiaochen. Immediately, Xiaochen said to Sangxing, "Go capture someone and ask him." Upon hearing Xiaochen's order, Sangxing immediately made his move. Soon, he caught a disciple of the Heavenly Sect who was in the Celestial Emperor realm. After being captured and brought in front of Xiaochen and the others, the disciple was clearly frightened. His face was pale, and his head was lowered. He didn't dare to look at Xiaochen and the others. Xiaochen had no interest in killing the man, so he said plainly, "Raise your head." And the others. Xiaochen. Xiao. Xiaochen only wanted to know the whereabouts of Yang Chen, Tao Ming, and the other Heavenly Sect experts. However, in response to Xiaochen's question, the Heavenly Sect's disciple shook his head repeatedly, indicating that he didn't know. The disciple wasn't lying. He really didn't know where Tao Ming, Yang Chen, and the others had gone. Everything seemed normal last night. However, when the Sword Sect launched their attack, they discovered that the Heavenly Sect's experts were nowhere to be found. Without the protection of the sect's experts, the ordinary disciples naturally panicked. Therefore, they didn't put up any effective resistance and the Heavenly Sect was defeated. It didn't seem like the disciple was lying. It was obvious that he really didn't know where the Heavenly Sect's experts were. Xiaochen didn't say anything else. He directly summoned a disciple from the Sword Sect and locked him up. The scattered battles continued. However, more and more Heavenly Sect disciples were captured alive. Of course, Xiaochen didn't need to worry about such matters. Naturally, there would be people who would deal with it. As for the captured heavenly sect disciples, Xiaochen temporarily sealed their cultivation and locked them up. He would deal with them in the future. Xiaochen didn't kill all of the heavenly sect disciples. Of course, to those who resisted, Xiaochen wouldn't show any mercy and directly killed them. More and more heavenly sect disciples were captured alive. Xiaochen, accompanied by Cangxing, Longqing, and the others, directly came to the heavenly sect camp. However, as he inspected the heavenly sect camp, Xiaochen's expression became uglier and uglier. Sect leader Yangchen wasn't there. Old ancestor Tao Ming wasn't there. The End Realm elders weren't there either. Even the Comprehension Realm and Dao Realm deacons weren't there. These people could be said to be the true pillars of the heavenly sect. If they weren't wiped out, the heavenly sect wouldn't be destroyed. However, they actually escaped. To Xiaochen, defeating a bunch of normal heavenly sect disciples was meaningless. The people that he needed to get rid of were nowhere to be found. This was what gave Xiaochen the biggest headache. They all ran? When he came to Yang Chen's living quarters, Xiaochen sat on the main seat. He was thinking about where Yang Chen and the others could have gone. The higher-ups weren't there. Xiaochen could only guess whether or not they all ran. They knew that they weren't a match for the sword sect. So, Yang Chen and the other heavenly sect higher-ups gave up on the heavenly sect disciples. They only brought a small number of elite disciples and escaped. However, even if they escaped, where did they escape to? Tianyin Tower, Mutian Mountain, or shrines? In Xiaochen's eyes, if Yang Chen and the others wanted to escape, they definitely went to the few powers that had a good relationship with the heavenly sect. If that was the case, then things wouldn't be easy. Sitting on the main seat, Xiaochen was in deep thought. 2 hours later, Cangxing reported that the battle had ended. Apart from a small portion of the heavenly sect disciples who escaped, the rest were either killed or captured. Today, the heavenly sect camp was under the control of the sword sect. However, after a careful search, they didn't find any clues about Yang Chen and the other higher-ups. Till now, they didn't know where they went. The battle had ended. Furthermore, the sword sect had obtained a complete victory. They didn't even pay a price and successfully took down the heavenly sect. However, after hearing Cangxing's report, Xiaochen's expression darkened. After a while, he said, "Pass down the order. Try your best to find the whereabouts of Yang Chen and the others. Not only in the heavenly residence, but also in Mutian Mountain, shrines, and Tianyin Tower. Send out spies. No matter what, we must find the whereabouts of the higher-ups of the heavenly sect. We must not let them escape." Yang Chen and the others were the real trouble. Xiaochen had to find their whereabouts. Hearing this, Cangxing nodded respectfully. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 2209. He ordered that Yang Chen, Tao Ming, and the others must be found because they were the real threat to the sword sect. As for the other disciples of the Heavenly Gate, they couldn't do anything, so Xiaochen didn't care about them at all. He ordered that Yang Chen, Tao Ming, and the others must be found because they were the real threat to the sword sect. As for the other disciples of the Heavenly Gate, they couldn't do anything, so Xiaochen didn't care about them at all. After passing down the order, Xiaochen stayed in Cangxing to deal with the remaining matters in the Heavenly Gate's encampment while he led his men to the Heavenly Gate. They didn't encounter any obstructions along the way. Of course, there was no news of Yang Chen and the others. They arrived at the Heavenly Gate safely, but the Heavenly Gate was already empty. All kinds of cultivation secret realms were destroyed, and everything that could be taken away was taken away. It was obvious that Yang Chen and the others had planned this beforehand. Faced with such a result, Longqing, Zhou Song, and Nangong Guan were even more certain that Yang Chen, Tao Ming, and the others knew that they were no match for them, so they chose to escape. Moreover, they had already planned to do so, otherwise, they wouldn't have emptied the entire heavenly sect. All signs showed that Yang Chen, Tao Ming, and the others had indeed escaped. However, where could they escape to in the Great Thousand World? They searched the entire Heavenly Gate, but in the end, they didn't find any valuable clues. The group arrived at the main hall of the Heavenly Gate. This used to be the meeting place of the Heavenly Gate, and it was also the center of the Heavenly Gate. However, it was now incomparably desolate. After looking around, Xiaochen said with some doubt, "There's no news at all. Where could they have run to?" So many higher-ups of the Heavenly Gate seemed to have evaporated into thin air. They disappeared without a trace, which made Xiaochen feel very unreconciled. Even though Hetian Prefecture was under the control of the Sword Sect, the higher-ups of Hetian Prefecture didn't suffer any damage and simply disappeared into thin air. In other words, the foundation of the Heavenly Sect was still there. Their upper echelons were still there, and they had not suffered any setbacks. As such, Xiaochen naturally could not relax. Who knew where Yang Chen was now, and what kind of trouble he would bring to the Sword Sect in the future? Xiaochen naturally understood this simple logic. Therefore, even if he didn't kill all the higher-ups of the Hetian sect, he had to at least severely injure them. Only then could the Sword Sect be considered safe. Xiaochen didn't feel too happy about defeating the Heavenly Gate. After all, this wasn't considered as defeating the Heavenly Gate. Rather, the Heavenly Gate had given up on the Heavenly Mansion in order to preserve their strength. Without any clues for the time being, Xiaochen could only suppress the dissatisfaction in his heart and began to take over the various forces in the Heavenly Mansion. There were many forces in the Heavenly Mansion, and all of them had submitted to the Heavenly Gate. Now that the higher-ups of the Heavenly Gate had fled and the Heavenly Mansion had been occupied by the Sword Sect, these forces naturally needed to be dealt with. Xiaochen's attitude towards the forces that were loyal to the Heavenly Gate was very simple. That was to kill them and destroy them directly. As for the forces that were willing to switch to the Sword Sect, after careful observation, he would let them live. Of course, Xiaochen was definitely not at ease with the Heavenly Gate and these former subordinate forces. Therefore, he didn't give them too many benefits. He even took all the resources that they had previously occupied and put them under the Sword Sect. It was naturally impossible to kill all the subordinate forces of the Heavenly Gate, but he couldn't let his guard down. Xiaochen left these matters to Nandong Guan and the others to deal with. As for Xiaochen and Jun Wuya, they were in charge of the Heavenly Gate. As he was worried about Yang Chen, Tao Ming was still hiding in the dark. Therefore, during this period of time, Jun Wuya didn't dare to be too far away from Xiaochen. He was afraid that Tao Ming would find a chance to assassinate Xiaochen. With Xiaochen's current strength, although he didn't need to worry about End Realm experts, he still couldn't block Emperor Realm experts. Unfortunately, after 3 days, Tao Ming and Yang Chen didn't appear. Furthermore, they were unable to find any clues about them, much less their whereabouts. Since they couldn't find the whereabouts of Yang Chen and the others, Xiaochen could only wait patiently. He put his focus on the matter of taking over the Heavenly Gate. At the same time, he also ordered the Sword Sect to be on guard. After all, no one knew whether Yang Chen and Tao Ming would sneak attack the Sword Sect. Time passed day by day, and everything seemed to have returned to normal. However, on the 5th day after the Sword Sect took over the Heavenly Gate, the heavy sound of a bell rang out in the sky once again. This was the sound of the Soul Reaping Bell. It meant that another Emperor Realm expert had fallen in that world. Along with the sound of the bell, everyone in the Great Thousand World heard this sound clearly. The people of the world were also affected by the sound of the bell. They all knelt down and cried loudly. At the Heavenly Gate, Xiaochen and Jun Wuya also looked at the sky in confusion. Another Emperor Realm expert had fallen? Who was it? 2 Emperor Realm experts had already fallen in a row. The previous one was the old ancestor of the Tool Sect. Who would it be this time? Surprised, Xiaochen immediately ordered Nandong Guan to investigate and find out which Emperor Realm Master had fallen, and why. It should be known that Emperor Realm experts were existences who stood at the peak of the Great Thousand World. They could even be said to be on equal footing with Tenzu. However, two such existences had fallen in such a short period of time. For some reason, Xiaochen had a bad premonition in his heart when he heard that another Emperor Realm expert had fallen. However, Xiaochen couldn't explain this feeling. While Xiaochen was waiting for Nandongguan to investigate, Longqing hurriedly walked into the courtyard where Xiaochen was staying with a look of deep worry on his face. "Little brother, I'm a little worried." Longqing was a little worried. It had been several days since he had sent a letter to Long Yuan, but he hadn't received a reply from Long Yuan. At first, Longqing thought that Long Yuan might be cultivating, so he didn't reply in time. However, so many days had passed, and there was still no news from Long Yuan. Moreover, Longqing had sent a letter to the others in Dragon Palace, but no one had replied to him. This made Longqing involuntarily worried. Hearing Longqing's words, Xiaochen's expression changed slightly. Longqing couldn't contact Dragon Palace, and the sound of the soul-reaping bell was still ringing in the sky. For a moment, Xiaochen seemed to think of something. Could it be that something has happened to Dragon Palace? But that's impossible. How could Yang Chen, Tao Ming, and the others take down Dragon Palace in such a short period of time? Xiaochen murmured softly. He had already suspected that something had happened to Dragon Palace, and that it had something to do with Yang Chen, Tao Ming, and the others. However, on second thought, he felt that it was unlikely. Please add this to your collection, monthly vote, and recommend this book. End of this chapter. Chapter 2210. Combined with the soul-reaping bell and Longqing's worries, Xiaochen guessed that something might have happened to Dragon Palace. Moreover, Xiaochen soon thought of the possibility that the missing Yang Chen, Tao Ming, and the others had attacked Dragon Palace and killed Long Yuan. However, on second thought, Xiaochen felt that it was impossible. First of all, Dragon Palace was not weaker than the Sword Sect, and Long Yuan was a veteran emperor. How could Tao Ming kill Long Yuan in just 5 days? Not to mention Tao Ming, even Jun Wuya would not be able to kill Long Yuan in just 5 days. Therefore, Xiaochen felt that it was impossible. Moreover, Yang Chen and Tao Ming, to put it bluntly, were already stray dogs. Even their headquarters had been occupied by the Sword Sect. How could they deal with Dragon Palace? Not to mention now, even if Heavenly Sect was at its peak, it would not be a match for Dragon Palace. Therefore, Xiaochen felt that it was impossible. However, the situation was indeed a little strange. The Emperor had died, and Longqing could not contact anyone in Dragon Palace. To be cautious, Xiaochen called Zhou Song and said seriously, "Second senior brother, please send someone to investigate what has happened to Dragon Palace recently." He asked Zhou Song to send someone to investigate what had happened in Dragon Palace recently. Hearing this, Zhou Song did not ask any more questions. He nodded and left quickly. After Zhou Song left, Longqing still looked worried. Of course, Longqing was more worried about Long Yuan. After all, Long Yuan had been good to her all these years. Longqing naturally did not want anything to happen to him. Looking at Longqing's worried face, Xiaochen comforted her, "Second sister, don't worry. Let's wait for second senior brother to send back the news. Then we'll talk about it." They didn't know what had happened to Dragon Palace, so it was too early to say anything. Hearing this, Longqing nodded. While Xiaochen had already noticed the abnormality in the Dragon Palace and asked Zhou Song to send someone to investigate, Yang Chen, Tao Ming, and Long Mia were sitting together in the Dragon Palace. Just as Xiaochen had guessed, what had happened in Dragon Palace was indeed related to Yang Chen and Tao Ming. Moreover, the ringing of the soul-dying bell did indicate the death of an Emperor Master. The Emperor Master who had died was none other than the ancestor of Dragon Palace, Long Yuan. Because at this time, in front of Tao Ming and the others, Long Yuan's body was on the spot. As for who killed Long Yuan, there was no doubt that it was Tao Ming. Only Tao Ming, who was also an Emperor Realm Master, had the ability to kill Long Yuan. However, Tao Ming's killing of Long Yuan was not only due to his contribution alone. There was also another person's contribution that could not be ignored, and that was Long Shui. If Long Mia hadn't poisoned Long Yuan when he was not around, causing him to be unable to exert his strength, Long Yuan wouldn't have been killed so easily by Tao Ming. It could be said that Long Yuan's death was unjust. He had died in the hands of his own people. At this time, with the death of Long Yuan, Long Mia quickly took control of Dragon Palace by virtue of his position as the palace master. Those who were loyal to Long Yuan and Long Qing were also ruthlessly eliminated by Long Mia. Finally taking control of Dragon Palace, Long Mia looked at Tao Ming and smiled, "Senior, your strength is indeed extraordinary. This time, we were able to kill Long Yuan thanks to your help. According to the agreement, Dragon Palace is willing to worship you as the ancestor." Long Mia and Tao Ming had secretly reached an agreement long ago. As for when, it was naturally when Long Qing led people to support the Sword Sect. On that day, an elder of Dragon Palace secretly visited Tao Ming and Yang Chen. This elder of Dragon Palace was Long Mia's confidant. It was during that meeting that both sides reached an agreement. Tao Ming helped Long Mia kill Long Yuan and help him take control of Dragon Palace. In return, Long Mia appointed Tao Ming as the new ancestor of Dragon Palace and took in a group of experts from Kadian sect. Yang Chen and Tao Ming, who were already at their wits' end, agreed to Long Mia's plan without much hesitation after hearing about it. This was because if they didn't agree to Long Mia's plan, it would be difficult for Tao Ming and Yang Chen to compete with the Sword Sect. In this way, it was a good choice to switch to Dragon Palace. Moreover, this time, almost all the higher-ups of Kadian sect survived without any casualties. With such strength, it was hard to say who would inherit Dragon Palace in the future. Long Mia was blinded by jealousy and thought of cooperating with Tao Ming. This was simply asking a tiger for its skin. One had to know that Tao Ming was an emperor-level expert, while Long Mia was just an end-realm expert. He thought that Dragon Palace would belong to him in the future, but he didn't know that it was no longer up to him to decide who would inherit Dragon Palace in the future. It was also because the time wasn't right that Tao Ming didn't make things difficult for him on the spot. Therefore, when he heard Long Mia's words, Tao Ming just smiled faintly and said, "Palace Master is too polite. We are just taking what we need. All right, I'll leave the rest to Palace Master. We'll go and rest first." As he spoke, Tao Ming left with Yang Chen and returned to his cave dwelling. In the cave, Yang Chen and Tao Ming sat opposite each other. At this moment, Yang Chen had a cold smile on his face and said, "There is actually such a stupid person in this world. Does he really think that Dragon Palace will belong to him in the future just because we helped him destroy Long Yuan?" Yang Chen despised Long Mia to the extreme. He really didn't expect that there would be such a stupid person in this world. This was no longer asking a tiger for its skin, but seeking his own death. Hearing Yang Chen's words, Tao Ming also smiled slightly. Obviously, he also felt that Long Mia was so stupid that it was cute. However, Tao Ming still reminded him, "It's not the time yet. Wait until Long Mia completely stabilizes the situation in Dragon Palace. Then, it will be time for us to take action. As for this period of time, it's okay to let him be happy for a while. Remember, don't be too hasty. Now is not the time to seize power." Although Tao Ming didn't care about Long Mia, it was obviously better for Long Mia to stabilize the situation in Dragon Palace than for Tao Ming and his disciples to step in. After Long Mia completely stabilized the situation in Dragon Palace, Tao Ming would directly kill Long Mia. Then, it would be natural for him to take control of Dragon Palace without any effort. It was like making a wedding dress for someone else. However, Long Mia still hadn't reacted at all. He didn't know that his approach was simply inviting a wolf into the house. As the saying goes, it's easier to invite a god than to send him away. Now that Long Mia had successfully invited Tao Ming and his disciples, it was not up to him to send them away. In the face of Tao Ming's reminder, Yang Chen also nodded seriously and replied, "Master, rest assured. I understand. Seeking for collection, monthly votes, recommendation." End of chapter. Chapter 22:11. The Dragon Palace suffered a great change. Long Yuan was killed by the joint forces of Long Mia and Tao Ming. The experts who were loyal to Long Yuan and Long Qing were also annihilated. The Dragon Palace suffered a great change. Long Yuan was killed by the joint forces of Long Mia and Tao Ming. The experts who were loyal to Long Yuan and Long Qing were also annihilated. It was impossible to hide such a big event from the world. Soon, Xiaochen learned about what had happened in the Dragon Palace. He also knew that Yang Chen, Tao Ming, and the others had joined the Dragon Palace. When Xiaochen first heard the news, he was shocked. He did not expect that Yang Chen and the others would join the Dragon Palace. Moreover, Tao Ming even killed Long Yuan. However, after calming down, Xiaochen quickly realized that Long Yuan's death must have been caused by someone from the inside. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for Tao Ming to kill Long Yuan on his own. At most, it would have been a lose-lose situation. Someone in the Dragon Palace betrayed them. It was not difficult to guess who it was. It was the palace master of the Dragon Palace, Long Mia. Xiaochen had even guessed the reason behind Long Mia's betrayal. It probably had something to do with Long Qing. Come to think of it, the position of Palace Lord was so valuable. Would Long Mia be willing to hand it over to someone else? Everything was due to jealousy. Long Mia was jealous that Long Qing had taken away his position as the palace master, so he chose to betray them. He joined forces with Tao Ming to kill Long Yuan and take control of the Dragon Palace. However, Xiaochen, Zhou Song, and Wu Huan sat in the courtyard and took a sip of wine. Xiaochen shook his head slightly and said, "This Long Mia must have lost his mind. He actually went to Tao Ming and joined forces to kill Senior Long Yuan. This is simply inviting a wolf into the house." Xiaochen could see the end of Long Mia at a glance. He had killed Long Yuan alone, so would the Dragon Palace become his? Little did he know that he was paving the way for someone else. Thinking about it, without Long Yuan in the Dragon Palace, who could keep Tao Ming in check? Could it be that Tao Ming helped Long Mia because it was as simple as it seemed? It was no exaggeration to say that Tao Ming had been eyeing the Dragon Palace since the beginning. Moreover, Long Mia's betrayal had a great impact on Xiaochen and the Sword Sect. At least, it gave Tao Ming, Yang Chen, and the higher-ups of the Kadian sect a way out. Originally, Xiaochen was absolutely confident that he could destroy Hetian's sect in this battle. But now, even though he occupied Hetian Mansion, Tao Ming and the others also occupied the Dragon Palace. In this way, it was equivalent to a superficial exchange between the two sides, and Tao Ming did not suffer any losses. In the end, it was Dragon Palace that suffered the real loss. To put it bluntly, it was because of Long Mia, the idiot, that Dragon Palace became the scapegoat of Kadian sect. He opened up a new path for Kadian sect, which was already doomed, and used the entire Dragon Palace as a shield for Kadian sect. He cursed Long Mia in his heart. After all, it was his stupidity that allowed Tao Ming, Yang Chen, and the others to escape. But it was useless to curse Long Mia to death now. Moreover, Xiaochen had another choice. Should he continue to pursue Tao Ming and the others? Because if he continued to pursue them, it was tantamount to starting a war with the Dragon Palace. After all, the Dragon Palace was now in Long Mia's hands. Moreover, the Sword Sect was exhausted after the fierce battle. It was difficult for them to continue fighting with the Dragon Palace at this time. Long Mia deserves to die. But junior brother, now is not the time to think about this. What should we do next? Do we continue to fight? Zhou Song asked. Zhou Song agreed that the Sword Sect wasn't suitable to continue the battle with their current situation. Besides, after this battle, the Sword Sect had annexed Kadian sect. They needed time to digest such a huge piece of territory. After all, the situation in Kadian sect wasn't stable yet and the Sword Sect needed to be strong enough to defend it. No matter how one looked at it, it wasn't suitable for the Sword Sect to start another war. If not, it wouldn't benefit the Sword Sect. Upon hearing Zhou Song's words, Xiaochen could only let out a slight sigh. I know, but my second sister, Xiaochen was aware of this, but Long Qing was in a tough spot. Ever since she learned about Long Yuan's death, Long Qing had locked herself in her room and refused to open the door even when Xiaochen called for her, which left Xiaochen heartbroken. Besides, the Sword Sect was indebted to Long Qing and the Dragon Palace. At this moment, Xiaochen couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Even without Long Qing, Xiaochen wouldn't just sit by and do nothing. Zhou Song and Wu Wan seemed to have guessed Xiaochen's thoughts. However, they didn't dissuade him. After all, Xiaochen was the sect leader of the Sword Sect and Xiaochen's will represented the will of the Sword Sect. As long as Xiaochen gave the order, no matter how exhausted the Sword Sect was, they wouldn't back down. But as soon as Xiaochen finished his sentence, Long Qing's door opened abruptly and Long Qing strode out with red, swollen eyes. Xiaochen hurried forward and asked with concern. "Second sister, you..." "Don't worry, little brother. I'm fine. I know this isn't the time to act on impulse and I won't do anything foolish." "Don't worry," Long Qing interrupted before Xiaochen finished his sentence. Long Qing was aware of the current situation and knew that it was meaningless to attack the Dragon Palace now. After venting her anger, Long Qing regained her composure. However, she still had a request that she hoped Xiaochen could agree to. Long Qing looked at Xiaochen and said unhurriedly, "Little brother, can you save those people from the Dragon Palace? They are loyal to me and master. Now that Long Mia is in power, he will definitely try his best to kill them. Can you save them?" Long Qing knew that it wasn't possible to avenge master in a day and night and she couldn't act on impulse. However, apart from revenge, Long Qing's only request was for Xiaochen to save those people from the Dragon Palace who were loyal to her and Long Yuan. In the face of Long Qing's request, Xiaochen agreed without hesitation. "Second sister, even if you didn't ask, I would still do it. You can now send a message to the Dragon Palace and find a reliable person to contact. I will send someone to pick them up." It was not difficult for Xiaochen to save these people and he didn't need to start a war with the Dragon Palace. Seeing that Xiaochen had agreed, Long Qing didn't say anything else. She nodded slightly and immediately contacted the people from the Dragon Palace through the voice-transmitting charm. She told them to leave the Dragon Palace as soon as possible and head to the designated location. At that time, only the people from the Sword Sect would be there to pick them up. After doing all this, Long Qing fainted in Xiaochen's arms. She was really tired and sad these days. Please add, recommend. End of chapter. Chapter 22:12. Looking at Long Qing, who seemed to have fallen into a deep sleep in his arms, a hint of heartache flashed across Xiaochen's eyes. He murmured softly, "Don't worry, second sister. I'll get my revenge one day." Xiaochen naturally wouldn't stand by and watch Long Qing take revenge. Xiaochen, Long Qing, and Xin Yuanling were already like a family many years ago. As a younger brother, he naturally wouldn't stand by and watch. He personally carried Long Qing back to her room and then checked her body. He found that she was just overly sad and didn't have any other serious problems. Xiaochen was secretly relieved. Then, Xiaochen left Long Qing's room and returned to the pavilion in the courtyard. He looked at Zhou Song and Wu Huan and said, "Senior brother, bring some people to the Dragon Palace. But you don't have to go deep. You just need to rescue those people from the Dragon Palace." Long Qing had already sent a message back to the Dragon Palace and told one of the End Realm elders to bring people to the rendezvous point. At that time, there would be people from the Sword Sect to receive them. Hearing Xiaochen's words, Zhou Song and Wu Huan nodded in agreement. Then, the two of them brought a group of Sword Sect experts and headed towards the Dragon Palace. They weren't going to come into direct contact with the Dragon Palace and Tao Ming. They were just going to rescue people. Xiaochen also specially instructed them not to go too deep into the Dragon Palace. Secondly, they weren't to fight. Once they rescued people, they were to retreat immediately. It wasn't time for revenge yet. Xiaochen could only forcefully suppress the killing intent in his heart. After the battle with the Hetian sect, the Sword Sect indeed needed some time to rest. At the same time, they needed some time to digest the Hetian manor that they had just conquered. However, the heaven-closing prefecture no longer existed. The former heaven-closing prefecture had been merged into the Sword Mansion, and the Great Thousand Worlds seemed to have returned to the right path. It had once again become the land of the 10 prefectures. Xiaochen personally oversaw the Jian clan. At the same time, Zhou Song and Wu Huan rushed to the agreed-upon location as quickly as they could after receiving their orders. It was a small town on the border of the Long Mansion. This was not the core area of the Long Mansion. Long Qing had sent a message to the Elder of the Dragon Palace, and both sides had agreed to meet here. When Zhou Song, Wu Huan, and the others arrived, the Elder of Dragon Palace had already arrived with thousands of experts and disciples of Dragon Palace. They were all loyal to Long Qing and were people that Long Mia had to kill. When both sides met, the first thing the Elder of Dragon Palace asked was, "How is Long Nu?" Long Nu was naturally referring to Long Qing. Upon hearing this, Zhou Song nodded and replied, "Don't worry. Long Qing is the second sister of our sect master. The sword sect will naturally not treat her badly. There's not much time left. If you have anything to say, save it for when we return to the Sword Mansion." Knowing that Long Qing was not in any danger, the Elder of Dragon Palace secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he nodded and accepted Zhou Song's proposal. After all, this was still the territory of the Long Mansion. No one knew when Long Mia would come, so it was better to leave as soon as possible. Before leaving, the Elder of Dragon Palace looked back angrily in the direction of the Dragon Palace. Long Mia, it was all because of this bastard. Because of him, the Dragon Palace today was no longer the Dragon Palace of the past. Thinking about the past few days, the Dragon Palace could be said to have been filled with blood. Anyone who dared to go against Long Mia was killed. Especially those who were loyal to Long Qing and Long Yuan. They were all killed. The reason why they were able to escape was all because of luck. When it happened, they were not in the Dragon Palace. That was why they were able to escape. However, it was obvious that Long Mia did not plan to let them go. He had already sent people to kill them. After a lot of hardships, they finally arrived at the place where they had agreed to meet with the Sword Sect. They were prepared to temporarily head to the Sword Sect to meet Long Nu. Long Yuan was dead. Long Qing was obviously the backbone of this group. However, just as they were about to leave, 4 terrifying auras descended from the sky. These auras were obviously at the End Realm level. 4 End Realm experts appeared. Seeing this, 2 End Realm elders stepped out. As for the others, they took the chance to leave with the experts of the Sword Sect. In the sky, 6 End Realm experts who were once elders of the Dragon Palace faced each other. 4 of them had already submitted to Long Mia. Looking at the other 2, one of the elders spoke. "A wise man submits to circumstances. Long Mia is the master of the Dragon Palace. The 2 of you should stop being so stubborn. Pfft, he wants to control the Dragon Palace. What a wishful thinking. His cooperation with Tao Ming is the same as inviting a wolf into the house. If the Dragon Palace is destroyed one day, he will be the biggest sinner." Hearing this, one of the 2 shouted angrily. It was obviously impossible for the 2 of them to submit to Long Mia. They wanted to personally kill Long Mia, so how could they choose to submit? Hearing this person's words, one of the 4 elders of the Dragon Palace, a middle-aged man, shouted coldly, "Why are you wasting your breath on them? Just kill them." Saying this, he was ready to attack. For against 2, they obviously had the advantage. However, at this moment, Zhou Song and Wu Huan suddenly appeared beside the 2 Dragon Palace experts. Seeing Zhou Song and Wu Huan appear, the 4 Long Mia henchmen were stunned. Then, they shouted coldly, "Zhou Song, Wu Huan. Why, does your sword sect want to interfere with the matters of the Dragon Palace?" My sword sect is naturally not interested in the matters of your Dragon Palace. However, Tao Ming, Yang Chen, and the people of Hetian's sect are all people that my sect must kill. Therefore, my sword sect naturally won't stand by and do nothing. Hearing this, Zhou Song laughed coldly and replied. Extremely arrogant. Emperor Ming is now the old ancestor of our dragon palace. You want to kill him? Hearing this, one of them shouted coldly. Ha, the old ancestor of the dragon palace? Only Long Mia can think of this. Forget it, I'm too lazy to talk nonsense with you today. If you want to fight, then fight. If not, then scram. Hearing this, Zhou Song laughed loudly. Tao Ming had actually become the old ancestor of the dragon palace. This was the biggest joke in the world. Long Mia didn't use his brain to think. Since Tao Ming had become the old ancestor of the dragon palace, then could the position of palace master still belong to him? Would the dragon palace still be the dragon palace? However, this was not what Zhou Song should be concerned about now. The purpose of this trip was to save people. Now, as long as he delayed the four of them and gave the others enough time to retreat, Zhou Song and Wu Huan's mission would be considered completed. Hearing Zhou Song's words, the four henchmen of Long Mia's face darkened. Then, they attacked together. Seeing this, Zhou Song, Wu Huan, and the other two were naturally not afraid. Immediately, the 8 End Realm experts fought fiercely. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 22:13. The 8 End Realm experts fought intensely. With the help of the Sword Sect, in the end, the Dragon Palace people retreated safely. Zhou Song and the other three also left safely after a fierce battle. The 8 End Realm experts fought intensely. With the help of the Sword Sect, in the end, the Dragon Palace people retreated safely. Zhou Song and the other three also left safely after a fierce battle. In a battle between End Realm experts, if it was 2 against 1, they might have a chance to kill the other. However, in a situation where they had the same number of people, it wasn't easy to kill an End Realm expert. Moreover, Zhou Song and the others didn't want to fight. After bringing the Dragon Palace people out of danger, the four of them also found a chance to leave safely. If Zhou Song and the others wanted to leave, as they were all End Realm, the 4 Dragon Palace elders naturally couldn't stop them. Just like that, Zhou Song and the others completed the mission of helping the Dragon Palace people safely retreat. As for the Dragon Palace side, after Zhou Song and the others left the Dragon Manor, they didn't continue to chase. After all, the current Dragon Palace didn't want to have any conflicts with the Sword Sect. This included Tao Ming and Yang Chen. Their mission was to control the Dragon Palace and not continue to fight with the Sword Sect. Therefore, Tao Ming and Yang Chen didn't send people to chase. After safely retreating from the Dragon Manor, a few days later, under the leadership of Zhou Song and Wu Huan, the Dragon Palace people arrived safely at the Sword Manor. After settling everyone down, Zhou Song and Wu Huan brought the 2 End Realm elders to meet Xiao Chen. The 2 of them were loyal to Long Qing, or rather, the 4 people of Long Yuan. One was called Long Xiang and the other was called Long Yi. In the main camp of the Hetian Manor, the 2 of them successfully met Xiao Chen and also Long Qing. Seeing Long Qing, Long Xiang and Long Yi were really emotional. At the same time, they scolded Long Mia for his actions and hoped that Long Qing could take revenge for Long Yuan. Hearing Long Xiang and Long Yi's scolding, although Long Qing hated Long Mia to the bone, he had already calmed down and knew that some things couldn't be rushed. If there was anyone to blame, they could only blame it on the fact that no one had noticed Draconic Annihilation's abnormality before. Draconic Annihilation and Tao Ming had joined forces and succeeded in the end. Now, if they wanted to kill Draconic Annihilation again, it would not be a simple matter. Looking at Long Xiang and Long Yi, Long Qing said in a low voice, "We naturally have to take revenge for Master, but we can't act rashly. My opinion is to stay in the Sword Sect for now. When the time is right, we can kill Long Mia and take revenge for Master." Long Qing spoke his mind. Although Long Xiang and Long Yi couldn't wait to kill Long Annihilation, they knew that it was impossible. Even though they were unwilling, they could only follow Long Qing's orders since Long Qing had given them the order. Long Yuan was dead, and Long Qing was their master from now on. Long Xiang and Long Yi didn't have any doubts about this. They chose to listen to Long Qing. As such, Long Xiang and Wang Yi cupped their hands and bowed to Xiaochen, who was sitting beside Long Qing. "Thank you for saving our lives, sect leader Xiaochen. No matter what, the sword sect's rescue was timely. If it wasn't for the sword sect's help, they probably wouldn't have been able to leave Long Mansion safely." Xiaochen didn't mind their gratitude. He waved his hand and said, "It's a small matter. Second sister and I are siblings. Second sister's matter is my matter, so don't worry about it. As for helping Long Xiang, Long Yi, and Xiaochen, it was all because of Long Qing, so there was no need for them to thank him. It was obvious that they couldn't return to Dragon Palace for the time being. Based on the current situation, it was definitely the best choice for Long Xiang and Long Yi to stay in the sword sect. At least their safety was guaranteed. Moreover, Long Qing was also in the sword sect. Therefore, Long Xiang and Wang Yi wouldn't leave. Dragon Palace still had Tao Ming. Yang Chen's matter could only be put aside for the time being. Xiaochen really didn't have the time and energy to deal with them. There were many things to deal with in the sword sect. Of course, the most important thing was the previous Hetian mansion. After all, they had just taken over the Hetian mansion and merged it into the sword mansion. There were many things to deal with. Under the leadership of the higher-ups in the sword sect, the situation in the Hetian mansion became more and more stable. The sword sect's control over the Hetian mansion also became more and more stable. Just as the sword sect was gradually merging the Hetian mansion into the sword mansion, a light screen suddenly appeared in the sky. The names of the 10 great Lingtian sects were displayed on the light screen. However, the names of the equipment refining sect and the Hetian sect gradually disappeared. Then, the names of the sword sect and the heavenly Yin Tower appeared on the list. This was Tenzu's recognition. Tenzu recognized the status of the sword sect and the heavenly Yin Tower and promoted the two sects to the 10 great Lingtian sects. As for the equipment refining sect and the Hetian sect, they could be considered to have been destroyed. Therefore, they naturally could no longer be counted as the 10 great Lingtian sects. The sword sect and the heavenly Yin Tower had just replaced them. As for Tao Ming, Yang Chen, and the higher-ups of the Hetian sect, although they were not dead, the Hetian sect no longer existed. Now, Tao Ming, Yang Chen, and the others were attached to the Dragon Palace. Therefore, the Hetian sect would naturally be kicked out of the 10 great Lingtian sects. Perhaps it was because of this that the Dragon Palace was still one of the 10 great Lingtian sects. However, no one could guarantee how long this situation would last. Perhaps Tao Ming and the others would directly take action tomorrow? Of course, this was not important to Xiaochen. With the appearance of the light screen and the change of the 10 great Lingtian sects, the sword sect was naturally very excited. Many disciples cheered. After so many years, the sword sect had finally returned to the 10 great Lingtian sects and stood at the peak of the Great Thousand World again. Even Songxing felt like crying as he looked at the light screen in the sky. Although he was already prepared, when the truth was placed in front of him, Songxing still could not believe his eyes. He could not believe that one day, he would actually be able to see the sword sect return to the altar and blossom with the glory of the past with his own eyes. It had always been Songxing's wish to let the sword sect return to the 10 great Lingtian sects. Now that his wish had finally come true, how could Songxing not be happy? It was not just the sword sect. On this day, the entire Great Thousand World was shaken by the change of the 10 great Lingtian sects. Especially when the word sword sect appeared on the light screen again, many sword cultivators in the Great Thousand World were deeply moved. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendation. End of chapter. Chapter 22:14. The sword sect used to be a sacred place for sword cultivators in the world. However, with the death of the heaven-breaking sword sovereign and some other changes, as well as the rise of the coiling sect, the sword sect finally fell from its pedestal. The sword sect used to be a sacred place for sword cultivators in the world. However, with the death of the heaven-breaking sword sovereign and some other changes, as well as the rise of the coiling sect, the sword sect finally fell from its pedestal. There was even a period when many people thought that the Sword Sect was going to be destroyed. However, every time the Sword Sect was pushed to the brink, it would always come back from the dead. It was because of this perseverance that the Sword Sect defeated a series of powerful opponents in the end. They even defeated the Coiling Sect in the end and successfully occupied a place among the 10 great Ling Tian sects, gaining the recognition of Tenzu. The golden light screen in the sky did not dissipate for a long time. This was Tenzu's announcement to the world. All the sword cultivators in the world were excited because the Sword Sect had returned to its pedestal, let alone the disciples of the Sword Sect. Everyone could not control their emotions. Even Xiao Chen's blood was boiling. After all, ever since he came to the Great Thousand World, Xiao Chen had been working hard to restore the Sword Sect to its former glory. Today, his goal had finally been realized. The only flaw was that he had defeated the Coiling Sect this time. He had not been able to kill Tao Ming, Yang Chen, and the other higher-ups of the Coiling Sect. In the end, they had escaped to the Dragon Palace. However, this could not be helped. After all, Xiao Chen did not have the ability to predict the future. However, if they escaped, then so be it. In the future, he would definitely kill them. Whether it was for the Sword Sect or for the Long Qing, Xiao Chen would not let Tao Ming, Yang Chen, and the others off. Everyone in the Sword Sect celebrated. Many disciples spontaneously organized banquets. Xiao Chen naturally wouldn't stop them. This was indeed something to be happy about. Xiao Chen even ordered that the Sword Sect celebrate for 3 days. All the wine and food would be provided by the sect. The Sword Sect was extremely excited. However, it was not only the Sword Sect but also the Heavenly Yin Tower. This time, there were 2 major sects among the 10 great Ling Tian sects. One was the Sword Sect and the other was the Heavenly Yin Tower. The Heavenly Yin Tower was also bustling with noise and excitement. However, compared to the Sword Sect, the Heavenly Yin Tower was not as excited. This was normal. After all, the predecessor of the Heavenly Yin Tower was the Equipment Refining Sect. The rise of the Heavenly Yin Tower was entirely based on the Equipment Refining Sect. Now that the Heavenly Yin Tower had replaced the Equipment Refining Sect and became one of the 10 great Ling Tian sects, it was hard for the entire Equipment Refining Sect to be excited. After all, many people still had feelings for the Tool Refining Sect. However, Yin Sheng and Yin Litian didn't care about this. Perhaps, it could be said that all of this was within their expectations. From the beginning when they took action against the Equipment Refining Sect, they had already expected this result. The Heavenly Yin Tower would definitely replace the Equipment Refining Sect and become one of the 10 great Ling Tian sects. Moreover, given the ambitions of Yin Litian and Yin Sheng, it was likely that this wasn't their only goal. They probably had even greater ambitions waiting to be carried out. Regardless of the Heavenly Yin Tower, the Sword Sect was celebrating. Xiao Chen even brought Qin Shuru's daughter and parents over to the place where the Heavenly Sect used to be. However, the Heavenly Sect was no longer here. Now, it belonged to the Sword Sect. Qin Shuru, who had been worried about Xiao Chen, heaved a sigh of relief when the Heavenly Sect was destroyed. At the same time, they were sincerely happy for the Sword Sect and Xiao Chen. Originally, it was just a celebration for the Sword Sect. However, as time passed, sword cultivators from all over the Great Thousand World rushed to the Sword Sect. For these sword cultivators, the Sword Sect was a sacred place in their hearts. Now that the Sword Sect had risen, these sword cultivators naturally had to come to congratulate them. Regardless of whether they were disciples of the Sword Sect or not, the Sword Sect represented the sword cultivators of the Great Thousand World. The stronger the Sword Sect was, the more glory these sword cultivators would feel. Thus, they were sincerely happy for the Sword Sect. Xiao Chen wasn't stingy with these sword cultivators who had rushed over from all over the world. He welcomed as many of them as he could. After all, the Sword Sect now had the strength and wasn't afraid of anyone causing trouble. What a joke! In the current Great Thousand World, who would dare to cause trouble in the Sword Sect? Not only did they have the strength of Ling Tian Sect, but they also had the title of Ling Tian Sect. Furthermore, they were recognized by Tenzu, so they had the right to do so. Everyone drank to their heart's content during the 3 days of the banquet. Even Xiaochen was drunk during these 3 days. Every day, he drank with Zhang Xing and the others and tossed all the annoying matters to the back of his mind. During the 3 days of the banquet, the sword sect could be said to have gathered all the sword cultivators in the world. Naturally, there was no lack of people with high cultivation. Through Xiaochen, Zhang Xing, and the others, the sword sect had indeed roped in some experts. Among them, there was one End Realm expert. This person had always been a solo cultivator. However, this time, he chose to join the sword sect. As such, the sword sect naturally had one more End Realm expert. Xiaochen wasn't stingy and directly conferred this person as one of the deputy sect masters of the sword sect. The sword sect naturally wouldn't reject powerful experts. As for some young sword cultivators with average talent and low cultivation, they also wanted to join the sword sect. This time, they also took the opportunity to come and try. After all, anyone could see that the sword sect had once again returned to the ranks of the 10 great Ling Tian sects. In the future, their achievements would naturally be glorious. If they could become a disciple of the sword sect, they would naturally be able to obtain many benefits. Firstly, there was no need to talk about the change in status. The disciples of the 10 great Ling Tian sects would definitely be respected wherever they went. Very few people would dare to offend people from the 10 great Ling Tian sects. Secondly, there were cultivation resources and illusions. After successfully returning to the ranks of the 10 great Ling Tian sects, the sword sect would only become more and more powerful in the future. The more powerful the sword sect was, the more cultivation resources its disciples would be able to obtain. Naturally, their cultivation speed would also be faster. Moreover, once they joined the sword sect, not only would they be able to obtain the protection of the sword sect, but even their families would be able to benefit from it. As such, many disciples from large families wanted to join the sword sect. Many people expressed their intentions to join the sword sect. However, because there were too many people, at least over 100,000 people, the sword sect naturally couldn't accept all of them. After all, the sword sect was one of the 10 great Ling Tian sects. They definitely couldn't be careless in recruiting disciples. Otherwise, if any random person could join the sword sect, wouldn't that make the sword sect disciples a joke? Moreover, in Xiaochen's heart, the sword sect disciples had to be elites. They might not be geniuses, but at the very least, they couldn't be too weak. Otherwise, they would become a joke when they went out. Therefore, the sword sect definitely couldn't accept all of these young people. However, the sword sect did indeed need some fresh blood. After all, the continuous battles had caused many casualties among the sword sect disciples. They urgently needed to be replenished. Begging for collection, autumn monthly ticket, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 22:15. After 3 days of revelry, there were still many people who did not choose to leave. Most of them were young people. After 3 days of revelry, there were still many people who did not choose to leave. Most of them were young people. They had already celebrated the return of the sword sect to the top 10 Ling Tian sects, but these young people were still unwilling to leave. In the end, they even gathered outside the sword sect and begged the sword sect to accept them. They also expressed their desire to join the sword sect and become a disciple of the sword sect. Xiaochen did not violently chase away these young people who wanted to join the sword sect because the sword sect did indeed need to recruit disciples on a large scale. Moreover, after successfully returning to the top 10 Ling Tian sects, Xiaochen was also considering many things that he had neglected before should be standardized. For example, when it came to recruiting disciples, many major forces would basically set a rule that they would recruit disciples from the outside every few years. Anyone who could pass the assessment would be able to pass. The sword sect also needed to follow this rule. Therefore, Xiaochen, Zhang Xing, and the other heavenly sect higher-ups gathered in the main hall of the Hetian residence. Xiaochen said with a faint smile as he looked at the crowd. Everyone, I've called everyone here today to talk about the recruitment of disciples. I've been thinking for the past few days that it's time for our sword sect to return to the right track after going through a series of battles. Xiaochen did not beat around the bush and directly explain the purpose of gathering everyone here today. Upon hearing that, Zhangxing nodded in agreement. Sect leader is right. The disciples are the foundation of a sect. Any sect needs a continuous influx of new blood. Recruiting disciples is indeed a major matter for the sword sect. We can't be careless about it. Zhangxing placed great importance on the recruitment of new disciples. After all, the new disciples were the future of a sect. The stronger and more talented the disciples were, the greater the potential of a force. Think about it, if there was a shortage of disciples, and there were no geniuses who could shoulder the burden, then no matter how strong the older generation was, there would always be a day when the sect would decline. Therefore, any sect would place great importance on recruiting and nurturing disciples, and the sword sect was no exception. Following Zhangxing's words, Zhou Song, Wu Huan, Nangong Guan, and the other vice sect leaders also spoke out. They all agreed with Zhangxing's words. Seeing that there was no disagreement among the crowd, Xiaochen smiled and said, "Indeed, the disciples are the foundation of our sword's gate, and we can't afford to be careless. Now that there are so many young people who want to join the sword's gate, what do you all think?" Coincidentally, the sword's gate was in need of new disciples. This time, taking advantage of the grand event where the sword's gate returned to the top 10 Ling Tian sects, there were many youngsters who were willing to join the sword's gate. It was a good opportunity to select the best among them. Xiaochen's idea was quickly approved by Zhangxing and the others. However, at this moment, Lin Qing spoke up. "Sect leader, now that our sword sect is at its peak, why don't we take this opportunity to hold a recruitment meeting for new disciples? Open to the entire Great Thousand World. Anyone under the age of 100 can sign up. We don't need to limit it to these people. In this way, all the young geniuses in the Great Thousand World will gather in the sword sect, and our sword sect will be able to recruit more young geniuses." Xiaochen's eyes lit up when he heard Lin Qing's suggestion to hold a recruitment meeting for new disciples that was open to the entire Great Thousand World. Coincidentally, during this period of time, Sword's Gate could be said to be in the limelight, and with this momentum, if it was as Lin Qing said, it would obviously be able to attract a lot of talented young people. When the time came, if they could absorb these people into Sword's Gate, it would definitely be a good thing for the development of Sword's Gate. Xiaochen immediately felt that Lin Qing's idea was feasible. Without much hesitation, he laughed loudly. "Haha, good. Deputy sect leader Lin Qing's suggestion is good, very good." He completely agreed with Lin Qing's suggestion. It was more perfect than he had imagined. In this way, the sword sect would gain more. It was not only limited to the tens of thousands of people outside the sword sect, but also to the entire Great Thousand World. They had to gather all the young people in the Great Thousand World, especially the young sword cultivators, and let them join the sword sect and become disciples of the sword sect. Xiaochen did not have any objections. As for the others, including Zhangxing, they were all in favor of Lin Qing's suggestion. Although holding a recruitment event like this would definitely require a huge amount of financial support, to the current Sword's Gate, this little bit of money was simply a drop in the ocean. It was nothing at all. No one objected. Then, they discussed some details and finally decided that the recruitment meeting would be held in a month's time. The location was set to be in the Sword Sect. A month's time was enough for the Sword Sect to stabilize the situation in the Sword Sect. On the other hand, it would allow the young warriors who were interested to join the Sword Sect to make sufficient preparations and give them enough time to rush to the Sword Sect. After the matter was settled, Xiaochen finally made the final decision. "Since Lin Qing was the one who suggested this, you will be in charge. Zhou Song and Wu Huan will assist you from the side." He handed over the recruitment meeting to Lin Qing. Since Lin Qing was the one who suggested this idea, it was naturally the most suitable to hand it over to him. As for Xiaochen, he directly became a hands-off manager. This was Xiaochen's habit. Unless it was an important matter that concerned the survival of the sword sect, Xiaochen would rarely handle it personally. Zhang Xing and the other deputy sect masters were enough. Moreover, Xiaochen did not like to be trapped in these trivial matters all day long. Compared to dealing with these trivial matters, Xiaochen was more willing to cultivate and improve his cultivation. The recruitment meeting was thus decided. 3 days later, the sword sect also announced to the public that they were preparing to hold a recruitment meeting for new disciples. Anyone below the age of 100 could participate. If they passed the assessment, they would immediately become a sword sect disciple and receive the protection of the sword sect and enjoy the treatment of a sword sect disciple. When this news was released, it naturally caused a huge uproar in the Great Thousand World. After all, the recruitment of disciples by the sword sect was extremely attractive. One must know that the status of the sword sect was no longer the same as before. Moreover, in order to attract more people, Lin Qing deliberately announced the treatment of the disciples of the sword sect. In the face of the high-standard treatment of the disciples of the sword sect, even the lowest outer disciple was enough to make many people jealous. Every month, not only would they receive a large amount of cultivation resources and elixirs, but they would also be able to enjoy the various cultivation secret realms in the sword sect. Furthermore, they would also receive guidance from the powerhouses of the sword sect. Who wouldn't want such a cultivation environment? Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 22:16. Following the announcement of the sword sect that the recruitment competition would be held a month later, all the young cultivators in the Great Thousand World were completely excited, especially the young sword cultivators. As sword cultivators, their first choice was naturally the sword sect. Although the sword sect had held recruitment competitions before, could the former sword sect and the current sword sect be mentioned in the same breath? Before Xiaochen succeeded as the sect leader of the sword sect would hold recruitment competitions from time to time. However, the sword sect was already in decline at that time, so the number of people who came to participate was pitifully small. After all, any young cultivator would definitely want to join the strongest sect, and the 10 great Lingtian sects were undoubtedly their first choice. As for a sect like the sword sect, which seemed to be in decline and could even be destroyed at any time, it was obviously not in the list of most people's choices. This was because once one joined a sect, it was tantamount to sharing both honor and disgrace. If the sect was destroyed, then the disciples of the sect would definitely not have a good ending. The disciples of the heavenly sect had foresight on this point. At this time, many of the disciples of the heavenly sect were either killed or dragged to the various large spirit stone mines under the sword gate to work as laborers. Their days were very miserable. Therefore, the strength of a sect was directly related to its attractiveness to many cultivators. The stronger the sect, the more people would naturally be attracted to join it. Perhaps one might think that this was unfair. In this way, wouldn't the stronger the sect, the weaker the sect, and the weaker the sect, the weaker the sect, the weaker the sect, the weaker the sect? In fact, this was indeed the case. This was the law of survival. The weak were destined to be eliminated, and the strong would only become stronger. However, the current sword sect had returned to the ranks of the 10 great Lingtian sects. Moreover, it was at its peak. As such, the sword sect's recruitment competition this time was obviously very attractive. Moreover, Lin Qing had directly announced the sword sect's treatment of disciples at all levels. Compared to the other 10 great Lingtian sects, the treatment of the sword sect's disciples was only higher, not lower. This made it even more attractive. Countless young cultivators in various cities in the Great Thousand World began to prepare to head to the sword sect and fantasize about successfully joining the sword sect and becoming a disciple of the sword sect. Thinking about the change in status once they became a disciple of the sword sect, just this point alone was enough to make countless people excited. I'm going to participate in the sword sect's recruitment competition. I'm determined to win in the sword sect's recruitment competition this time. Son, you have to work hard this time. If you can join the sword sect, you'll bring honor to your ancestors. The rise and fall of a family in the future will depend on you. Poor cultivators from ordinary families wanted to join the sword sect and change their fates. Disciples from large families also set off for the sword sect under the escort of their elders. Unlike the poor martial artists, the disciples of the big clans could also cultivate in their own clans, but if they could enter the sword's gate, it would be a completely different concept. There was no need to mention the amount of cultivation resources and cultivation environment. The sword sect's cultivation environment was definitely better than 99% of the forces in the Great Thousand World, and it was not just a little bit better. However, for disciples from large families, this was secondary. What they valued the most was the change in status after joining the sword sect. Some disciples from large families did not lack cultivation resources, at least for now. What they valued was the identity of a disciple of the sword sect. Because once they became a disciple of the sword sect, it was equivalent to them being protected by the sword sect. Not only them, even if their families were to encounter danger in the future, the identity of a disciple of the sword sect was sufficient to make many people fearful. After all, a disciple of the sword sect, even if it was only an outer court disciple, was not someone that could be killed as one wished. If one angered the sword sect, in the entire Great Thousand World, apart from the other sects in the Great Thousand World, who else could withstand the wrath of the sword sect? As the saying goes, when a man achieves the Tao, even his chickens and dogs can ascend to the heavens. So long as one person from a family was able to join the sword sect, it was equivalent to adding a protective talisman for the family, an additional life-saving trump card. Therefore, in the face of the sword sect's recruitment competition, it was not only the martial artists from poor families who placed great importance on it, but the disciples from large families also placed great importance on it. Countless young martial artists came from all over the Great Thousand World, from all the major cities, and rushed towards the same destination, and this destination was the sword sect. As the time drew closer, more and more young cultivators arrived at the cities around Swords Gate and settled down, quietly waiting for the start of the Swords Gate recruitment tournament. At the same time, Xiaochen brought his wife, daughter, parents, Long Qing, Nangong Guan, and the others back to the sword sect. As for the former Hetian mansion, although it was not truly stable, there were no major problems. Therefore, Xiaochen left Sangxing to oversee the situation there while he rushed back to the sword sect to prepare to host the recruitment competition. After returning to the sword sect, Xiaochen spent his free time with his parents, wife, and daughter. This made Qin Shuru and the other women very happy. However, if one were to ask who was the happiest during this period of time, it would be Xiaochen's daughter, Xiao Luan. Xiao Luan was the happiest to be able to have Xiaochen's company. On this day, Lin Qing took the initiative to find Xiaochen. The two sat down in a pavilion in the bamboo garden. Xiaochen personally brewed a cup of tea for Lin Qing, then smiled and asked, "How is it? Did you encounter any difficulties in the recruitment competition?" Lin Qing had always been in charge of the recruitment competition, so Xiaochen rarely asked about it. At this time, when faced with Xiaochen's question, Lin Qing answered truthfully. "Sect Master, the scale of this recruitment competition is much larger than I expected. There are still 10 days until the start of the recruitment competition, but according to the statistics below, the number of young martial artists who have arrived at the cities around the sword sect has already exceeded 100,000, and this number is still increasing. The number of people who wanted to participate in the recruitment competition was much more than expected. It could be said that the attraction of the sword sect to young martial artists was far more terrifying than Xiaochen and Lin Qing had imagined. However, Xiaochen was happy about this. He said with a smile on his face, "Isn't this a good thing? The more people who come, the more people think highly of our sword sect." "That's true, but with so many people, Sect Master, the cost of this recruitment competition is probably much higher than expected." Lin Qing smiled bitterly when he heard this. Lin Qing was a little distressed by the huge cost, but Xiaochen did not mind it at all. He smiled and said, "It's nothing. It's just money. Lin Qing, don't worry about money. This is the first recruitment competition that our sword sect is holding since we returned to the 10 great Ling Tian sects. we must do it well and not tarnish the sword sect's reputation. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 22:17. Xiaochen didn't care much about money. In Xiaochen's opinion, money was nothing. Xiaochen didn't feel any heartache about spending it on the recruitment competition. Xiaochen didn't care much about money. In Xiaochen's opinion, money was nothing. In Xiaochen's opinion, money was nothing. Xiaochen didn't feel any heartache about spending it on the recruitment competition. With Xiaochen's words, Lin Qing felt relieved. As long as they had enough money, everything else would be easy to handle. In fact, Lin Qing's worries were making a mountain out of a molehill. The current sword sect was completely different from before. Not only was it powerful, but it was also rich in money. Lin Qing didn't have to worry about anything and could just do whatever he wanted. After receiving Xiaochen's affirmation, Lin Qing quickly left and personally went to arrange the recruitment competition. Under Lin Qing's supervision, the recruitment competition was being prepared in an orderly manner. As the time for the recruitment competition approached, more and more young cultivators arrived at the Sword Mansion. They were all preparing to participate in the recruitment competition. Some were poor cultivators, while others were disciples of large clans. For the recruitment competition, the Sword Sect had specially prepared accommodations for the participants in the surrounding cities. As the time approached, the process of the recruitment competition for the Sword Sect was finally finalized. According to Lin Qing and the others' discussion, there were 3 stages to the recruitment competition. The first stage was the preliminary selection. At that time, many young cultivators who participated in the recruitment competition would be brought to a small world in the Sword Sect called the Demon King Plain. There were many demonic beasts inside. Those who passed the first round would be able to enter the second round. As for the second round, it was a life and death battle with some of the Heavenly Sect's disciples who were on death row. It just so happened that many of the Heavenly Sect's disciples had been captured by the Sword Sect. Some of them had not killed any of the Sword Sect's disciples and were brought to the various Spirit Stone mines to work as laborers. As for those whose hands were stained with the blood of the Sword Sect's disciples, they were directly used by Lin Qing as a test for this recruitment competition. As for the third round, it was an ordinary single elimination tournament. This was also to determine the ranking of the new disciples. Basically, as long as one could pass the first and second round, they would be qualified to join the Sword Sect. The third round, on the other hand, was mainly to test one's talent and strength. Because of this, many of the higher-ups of the Sword Sect would be present during the third round, including Sect Master Xiaochen. There was no need to hide the process of the large competition. Therefore, 3 days before the start of the large competition, Lin Qing announced the process of the large competition. Many young warriors who came to participate in the large recruitment competition knew the entire process. Naturally, no one had any objections to the process of the large competition. Moreover, even if there were any objections, it would be useless. After all, this was the rule set by the Sword Sect. After knowing the process of the large competition, many young warriors began their final preparations. First was the first round. Because the rules did not say that they could not seek help, many young warriors began to look for companions. They were prepared to help each other in the first round. The first round of the large competition allowed teaming up. After entering the Myriad Demons Plain, the proof that everyone passed was a token. Before the large competition began, the Sword Sect would place 10,000 tokens in the Myriad Demons Plain. Those who obtained the tokens would be able to enter the second round. In other words, only 10,000 people could pass the first round. As for the token, the Sword Sect did not care. It did not matter if you found the tokens yourself, snatched them from the hands of demonic beasts, or snatched them from the hands of others. The Sword Sect did not care. They only cared about the final result. Those who obtained the tokens would be able to enter the second round. To put it bluntly, the first round was to screen out those who were not strong enough. After all, Xiaochen had said that the sword sect's disciples had to be elites. Although they might not be the best among their peers, they definitely could not be existences without any talent. Lin Qing was very clear about Xiaochen's requirements. That was why he set such a rule. Once the rule was announced, many young warriors who participated in the large recruitment competition immediately felt the pressure. Needless to say, the competition in the first round would probably be extremely intense. After all, more than 100,000 people were fighting for 10,000 tokens. The intensity of the competition could be imagined. However, there were also a small number of people who were unmoved. They were filled with confidence in their own strength and felt that they would definitely be able to break out of the encirclement. That's how it should be. If any Tom, Dick, or Harry can enter the sword sect, then your status as a disciple of the sword sect is too weak. Ha, that's right. However, I heard that the sword sect leader, Xiaochen, will personally attend the large recruitment competition. However, he will be in the third round. So what? With our strength, do you think we won't be able to make it to the third round? Many young warriors were either worried, nervous, or secretly excited. This was because the news that Xiaochen would personally attend the large recruitment competition had already spread. To these young warriors, Xiaochen was their idol. Ever since Xiaochen went to the Great Thousand World alone and became the sect leader of the sword sect, Xiaochen's experience was simply like a legend. It was something that people talked about enthusiastically. It could be said that a large part of the reason why so many young warriors participated in the large recruitment competition this time was because of Xiaochen's personal charm. Many young warriors looked up to Xiaochen as their role model. As such, they naturally wanted to join the sword sect. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. Early in the morning, many young warriors gathered at the foot of the sword sect. They were already prepared to enter the demon's plane. More than 100,000 young warriors were either in groups of 3 to 5 or resting with their eyes closed. They were all waiting for the large recruitment competition to begin. Soon, dozens of spatial cracks appeared in the sky amidst the crowd's discussion. Then, a total of 20 sword sect elders and 2 sword sect heads appeared in the sky. Naturally, Lin Qing could not personally attend the first round of the large recruitment competition. Therefore, the examiners for this round were the 2 sword sect heads of the sword sect. However, even in the face of 2 sword sect heads, many young warriors present did not dare to be impudent. Everyone knew that the sword sect heads of the sword sect were Dao realm experts. Ordinary elders were also Dao realm experts. For many young warriors present, such experts were existences that they could only look up to. Therefore, after the experts of the sword sect appeared, many young warriors present quieted down and looked at the sky without blinking. Faced with the crowd's gazes, the 2 sword sect heads of the sword sect had a thick sense of pride on their faces. Although the 2 sword sect heads were not the absolute upper echelons of the sword sect, in the outside world, their status as sword sect heads was enough to make many people not dare to underestimate them. This was all because of the strength of the sword sect. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 22:18. With pride on their faces, the 2 sword chiefs scanned the hundreds of thousands of young warriors below. At this moment, they were indeed proud of the sword sect. It was precisely because the sword sect was powerful enough that the 2 sword sect chiefs could receive the respect of so many people. One of the white-haired old men cleared his throat and slowly spoke. With the support of spiritual energy, his voice was transmitted into the ears of everyone present. On behalf of the sword sect and the sect master, this old man welcomes everyone to participate in this recruitment competition. At the same time, I hope that everyone will be able to move forward courageously. The first round of the competition will begin. Without further ado, the 2 of them opened the entrance to the 10,000 demons plane at the same time as soon as the old man finished speaking. A door of light slowly appeared in front of everyone. This was the entrance to the demons plane. After the entrance opened, the white-haired old man spoke again. The first round of the competition will last for 7 days. After 7 days, everyone will be restrained and sent out of the demon's plane. During this period, the sword sect will not interfere with anything that happens within the demon's plane. Therefore, the first round of the competition is life-threatening. If anyone wishes to withdraw, you may leave now. Think about it carefully, the entrance to the demon's plane will be closed in 2 hours. The first round of the competition was indeed life-threatening. Or rather, other than the third round, the first and second round of the competition were all life-threatening. This point required the young martial artists to weigh the pros and cons. If there were some who cherished their lives, then they could choose to leave and not participate in the recruitment competition. The Swords Gate would not force them either. However, after hearing the white-haired old man's words, many young warriors present did not choose to withdraw. They were all warriors, so naturally, there would not be too many people who were afraid of death. This was because everyone knew that since they had stepped onto the martial path, they could only move forward courageously. Otherwise, they would only be annihilated by the masses. Especially for these young warriors, they had the spirit of newborn calves who were not afraid of tigers. Everyone had a dream in their hearts. They all dreamed of one day becoming a giant like the Sword Sect master, Xiaochen, standing at the peak of the Great Thousand World and overlooking the world. Thus, under the momentum of their dreams, many young warriors quickly swarmed towards the demon's plane. In everyone's opinion, joining the Sword Sect was a step for them. If they could become a disciple of the Sword Sect, it might be enough to change their lives. Seeing that not many people chose to withdraw, the 2 sword chiefs in the sky revealed a faint smile. One of them spoke faintly. "Elder Lin, have you seen any good seedlings?" "There are a few, but we can't say for sure in the end. After all, this is only the first round of the competition." "That's true. However, I've heard that Lord Sect Master is placing great importance on this recruitment competition. You and I can't mess it up. That's for sure. This old man naturally won't disappoint the Sect Master and Vice Sect Master Lin Qing's trust." After many young warriors entered the demon's plane, some of the experts from the large clans took the initiative to visit the 2 sword chiefs. There was no lack of Dao realm experts among them. However, although they were both Dao realm experts, their identities were completely different. The sword chiefs of the Sword Sect were enough to make any Dao realm experts not dare to offend them. In the face of these experts from the large clans, the 2 sword chiefs were very calm. The white-haired elder who spoke earlier also spoke faintly. "Everyone, it is indeed inconvenient for the 2 of us during the grand competition. I hope that everyone can understand. As for the outcome of the grand competition, everything will depend on the final token. Everyone, please be patient and wait for the results." Some of the experts from the large clans wanted to get close to the 2 sword chiefs. They even wanted to bribe the 2 sword chiefs to ensure that their juniors could pass the first round of the competition. Unfortunately, the 2 sword chiefs did not buy it. Naturally, the 2 of them did not dare to secretly manipulate the results of the first round of the competition. It should be known that not only Lin Qing, but even Xiaochen placed great importance on this competition. If anyone dared to do anything in the competition, they would undoubtedly be courting death. After speaking, the 2 sword chiefs left. Although the experts from the large clans felt that it was a pity, they did not dare to say anything. They could only resentfully disperse and wait for the results of the first round of the competition. Many young warriors entered the demon's plane. For a moment, the demon's plane was bustling with noise and excitement. However, no one knew that when they entered the demon's plane, Xiaochen, Qin Shuru, and Long Qing, who were in the Sword Sect, were paying attention to the situation in the demon's plane. To be precise, Xiaochen and the others were paying attention to Xiao Luan's situation. That's right, Xiao Luan's figure was mixed in with the crowd of young warriors. Xiao Luan also participated in this competition. This was also her own request. As she grew older, Xiao Luan no longer looked like a 7 or 8-year-old child. Instead, she had grown into a 16 or 17-year-old girl. Her appearance was fresh and beautiful. Her appearance was not inferior to her mother, Qin Shuru, and the others. As Xiao Chen's daughter, Xiao Luan actually did not need to participate in this competition. However, Xiao Luan said that even though she was her father's daughter, she wanted to be like the others and start from the most ordinary sword sect disciple. She did not want to always rely on her father, Xiao Chen. Qin Shuru and the other girls were worried about Xiao Chen's decision. However, Xiao Chen was very supportive of it. It could even be said that Xiao Chen was very pleased that Xiao Luan had such thoughts. At this moment, Xiao Luan was mixed in with the crowd on the light mirror. She had just passed through the entrance and was heading towards the depths of the myriad demons plane alone. Qin Shuru and the other girls had long treated Xiao Luan as their own daughter. Among them, Gu Lingyao could not help but ask as she looked at Xiao Luan's back. "Husband, have you checked all the demonic beasts in the myriad demons plane? There are no existences above the immortal emperor realm, right? We can't let our guard down." The girls had asked this question many times. As this matter concerned Xiao Luan, they were naturally very attentive. They even personally went to Lin Qing and asked him to ensure that there were no demonic beasts above the immortal emperor realm and the myriad demons plane. After hearing Gu Lingyao's words, Xiao Chen helplessly smiled and said, "We have already checked countless times. Don't worry, Luan Luan is not as weak as you think." He did not know whether to laugh or cry. However, after hearing Xiao Chen's words, Tianyu directly said, "As her father, of course you don't have to worry. I have never seen you showing concern for Luan Luan. Let me tell you, if Luan Luan is in any danger, even if it means breaking the rules, I will intervene. Don't stop me at that time. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendation." End of chapter. Chapter 22:19. Qin Shuru and the others doted on Luan Luan to the extreme. Just as Tianyu finished speaking, Xiao Qing and Bai Ruyue also strode into the courtyard. Bai Ruyue came to Xiao Chen's side and complained unhappily, "Chen, how can you let Luan Luan go to the demon's plane? What if something happens?" Obviously, Bai Ruyue had heard that Xiao Luan was participating in the recruitment competition and came over to ask about it. Faced with his mother's complaint, Xiao Chen looked helplessly at his father, Xiao Qing. However, Xiao Qing also had a helpless expression on his face. There was no other way. Xiao Chen couldn't bring out his dignity as the sect master of the sword sect in front of his parents. He stood up and gave his seat to Bai Ruyue. Then, he massaged Bai Ruyue's shoulders and said softly, "Mother, don't worry. Mother, don't worry. Luan Luan is not as weak as you think. Nothing will happen to her. You think nothing will happen just because you say so? Chen, let me tell you. If anything happens to Luan Luan, I won't let you off." Bai Ruyue had an expression that said, "I'll teach you a lesson." Seeing this, Xiao Chen nodded in agreement. Xiao Chen already knew that Bai Ruyue doted on Luan Luan. However, he didn't expect that so many things would happen just because Luan Luan signed up for the recruitment competition. Bai Ruyue was clearly anxious. In the end, even Qin Shuru and the others comforted her. They even pointed out Luan Luan's location in the light mirror to Bai Ruyue. Bai Ruyue was slightly relieved when she saw Luan Luan through the light mirror. However, due to the worry in her heart, Bai Ruyue didn't go. She wanted to stay here and watch Luan Luan until the end of the first round of assessment. No matter what Xiao Chen said, Bai Ruyue refused to listen. In the end, Xiao Chen had no choice but to accept his fate. Everyone stared at the light mirror, afraid that Luan Luan would be in danger. In this regard, Xiao Chen and Xiao Qing were helpless. They could only go to the side and drink by themselves. Xiao Qing could understand Xiao Chen. However, as women, Bai Ruyue and the others obviously couldn't. They didn't care about anything else and only cared about Luan Luan's safety. Moreover, in the eyes of women like Bai Ruyue, since Xiao was the sect master of the sword sect, there was no need for Luan Luan. Luan Luan didn't need to participate in the recruitment competition. Luan Luan didn't have nothing better to do. Luan was. Luan be a useless trash, only rely on herself. Was only relied on herself. On. Was. Luan was Luan was a trash to was. In. Was Luan was in was Luan s was in was, in s's. Was Luan was the Luan was Luan be. Therefore, when Luan proposed to participate in the recruitment competition, Xiaochen was in favor of it. He didn't even tell Lin Qing so that Luan wouldn't receive any preferential treatment. He hoped that Luan would be able to complete the recruitment competition with her own strength and not rely on her own identity. That would be meaningless. All the women were worried about Luan. Xiaochen and Xiaoqing were drinking silently at the side. Luan didn't know that so many people were looking at her. After entering the Myriad Demon's plane, she didn't team up with anyone and directly headed to the depths of the plane. In Luan's opinion, the closer one was to the core of the Myriad Demon's plane, the more tokens there would be. As long as she could snatch a token, she would be able to pass the first round of the assessment. Luan was already a big girl. As she traveled alone, a faint smile hung on the corner of her mouth. However, her expression gave people a feeling of stubbornness as she softly muttered to herself. This time, I'll definitely give father a big surprise. As Luan grew older, she hoped more and more to gain Xiaochen's approval. However, with such a heaven-defying father, it was indeed very difficult for Luan to surpass Xiaochen. However, this was also part of Luan's unyielding character. This time, Luan took the initiative to participate in the recruitment competition because she wanted to impress Xiaochen. She secretly swore that she would perform well this time and surprise her father. Luan held her breath and strode toward the depths of the Myriad Demon's plane. Along the way, Luan did encounter many attacks from demonic beasts. However, with Xiaoluan's current cultivation and combat strength, ordinary demonic beasts were basically no threat to her. Moreover, for this recruitment competition, some of the more powerful demonic beasts in the Myriad Demon's plane had already been wiped out by the experts of the Sword Sect. As Xiaoluan made her way to the core of the Myriad Demon's plane, she finally encountered a perfected Celestial Emperor stage demonic beast. At a glance, she saw the token in the demonic beast's hand. Upon seeing this, Xiaoluan's eyes lit up. She immediately attacked the demonic beast. Since Xiaoluan's cultivation had already reached the perfected Celestial Emperor stage, it did not take her long to kill the demonic beast and successfully obtain the token. As soon as she entered the Myriad Demon's plane, Xiaoluan obtained the token. With the token in her hand, an excited smile appeared on her face. She even waved her fist in the air. Bai Ruyue, Qin Shuru, and the others, who had been observing Xiaoluan through the light mirror, also smiled when they saw Xiaoluan successfully obtaining the token. However, at this moment, a group of young cultivators appeared in front of Xiaoluan. The leader of the group was dressed in a luxurious brocade robe. It was obvious that he was a disciple of a big family. When this group of people appeared in front of Xiaoluan, they involuntarily looked at the token in Xiaoluan's hand. Upon seeing this, Xiaoluan's eyes were filled with vigilance. She said with some displeasure, "What's the matter? Miss, we have no ill intentions and will not snatch the token." "You can rest assured," the leader of the group said with a smile. At the same time, a hint of amazement flashed in his eyes when he looked at Xiaoluan. It was obvious that this young man was attracted to Xiaoluan. Xiaoluan was very beautiful. She was not inferior to Qin Shuru and the other ladies except that she was a little immature. His eyes were filled with admiration. When Xiaoluan was about to leave, the young man chased after her and said politely, "May I know your name, miss?" "I'm Qin Xian. There are many demonic beasts in the Myriad Demon's plane. Since Miss is alone, why don't we travel together?" It was obvious that Qin Xian had feelings for Xiaoluan. However, Xiaoluan was not interested in this and said, "There's no need for that. I'm not used to being with unfamiliar people." Having said that, Xiaoluan disappeared from the spot in a flash. Qin Xian looked at Xiaoluan's departing figure and murmured reluctantly, "What a beautiful woman, begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 22-20. The Qin family that Qin Xian was in was a large family with at least 3 End-realm experts. Qin Xian was the only son of the current head of the Qin family and could be said to be the young master of the Qin family. He had shown great talent since he was young and was highly valued by the higher-ups of the Qin family. This time, they wanted Qin Xian to participate in the sword sect's recruitment competition. Firstly, the Qin family thought highly of the sword sect and wanted to use Qin Xian to enter the sword sect to form a relationship with the sword sect. Secondly, it was to train Qin Xian. One must know that although the Qin family was strong, it depended on who they were compared to. Compared to the sword sect, the Qin family was nothing. Therefore, it was normal for Qin Xian to enter the sword sect. Qin Xian had originally thought that this recruitment competition was just a formality for him. All along, Qin Xian had been very confident in his talent and combat strength. He believed that he would definitely succeed in this recruitment competition, so from the beginning to the end, Qin Xian actually didn't have much fighting spirit. Qin Xian originally thought that it would be a boring recruitment competition, but after seeing Xiao Luan, he didn't think so anymore. Since he was young, Qin Xian had seen many beauties. Even in the city where the Qin family was located, there were countless girls who liked Qin Xian. However, Qin Xian had never met a girl who could move his heart. After seeing Xiao Luan, Qin Xian admitted that he was moved. When he saw Xiao Luan for the first time, Qin Xian had a feeling that his heart was moved. He looked in the direction that Xiao Luan left in a daze. At the same time, the few young men who came with Qin Yuan went up and said, "Young master, do you want me to investigate this girl's identity?" "No need. You can't help me with this." Qin Xian smiled and rejected them. Although Qin Xian was a little arrogant, he wasn't bad overall. At least, he didn't bully others like the other disciples of big families. His reputation was not bad. As for his arrogance, there was nothing that could be done about it. After all, Qin Xian's family background and his own talent were all there. It would be strange if such a person did not have any arrogance. However, facing Xiao Luan, Qin Xian planned to use his own ability to pursue her. He didn't need to use any tricks. Of course, Qin Xian wouldn't use any tricks to pursue a woman, especially when it was his first time falling in love with a woman. As soon as Qin Xian finished speaking, he immediately chased after Xiao Luan without waiting for anyone to reply. Qin Xian had already made up his mind to pursue Xiao Luan and make her his woman. However, Xiao Luan was completely unaware of this. Since young, she had never been in close contact with any man other than Xiao Chen and Xiao Qing. Naturally, Xiao Luan knew nothing about relationships between men and women. Now that he had obtained his own token, Xiao Luan was no longer in a hurry. He strolled around leisurely as if he was on a scenic tour. As Xiao Luan strolled around the demon plain leisurely, he soon met 3 young martialists who were participating in the recruitment contest. The 3 of them blocked Xiao Luan's path. One of them even sneered. "Little beauty, are you alone? Why don't you join us?" Compared to Qin Xian, the 3 of them were obviously much easier to deal with. In response, Xiao Luan shouted coldly, "Get lost." Xiao Luan didn't have a good impression of the 3 of them. However, the 3 of them were unmoved by Xiao Luan's cold shout. They even laughed out loud. "Ha, you have a personality. But I like it." Xiao Luan was about to retaliate when a green light shot out from afar. Immediately, one of the men was hit by the green light and was sent flying. Xiao Luan was about to retaliate when Xiao Luan was about to retaliate. Someone made a move. The person who made the move was none other than Qin Xian. After sending one of them flying, Qin Xian appeared beside Xiao Luan. He looked at Xiao Luan with concern and asked, "How are you? Are you all right?" Qin Xian's attitude was completely different from the 3 of them. He was worried from the bottom of his heart. In response, Xiao Luan gently shook her head to indicate that she was fine. After confirming that Xiao Luan wasn't injured, Qin Xian turned to look at the remaining two. At the same time, the two of them revealed a ferocious look and shouted. "Who are you? Are you courting death? Heh, shameless boasting. How dare you say such words? I am Qin Xian from the Qin clan. Do you have the ability to fight? I would like to see who is courting death today," Qin Xian said nonchalantly. When the two of them heard this, their expressions changed. They had naturally heard of the Qin clan. Immediately, one of them asked in fear. "Qin clan? Which Qin clan? Which Qin clan did you say it was?" Qin Xian coldly laughed. Just the Qin clan alone was enough to make the two of them tremble in fear. Seeing this, Qin Xian couldn't be bothered to waste time with the two of them and immediately shouted. "Get lost." In response to Qin Xian's cold shout, the two of them didn't dare to stay any longer. They didn't dare to provoke the Qin clan. Immediately, they left with the person who was injured by Qin Xian. After the three of them left, Xiao Luan curiously looked at Qin Xian and asked, "Are they afraid of you?" Naturally, she could tell that Qin Xian's family wasn't simple. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to scare the three of them away with just a few words. They didn't even dare to say a single word. However, Xiao Luan was merely curious. After all, no matter how extraordinary Qin Xian's family was, how could it be compared to her? One should know that Xiao Luan was the daughter of the sword sect's leader, Xiaochen. Seeing that Xiao Luan took the initiative to ask him, Qin Xian naturally didn't know what Xiao Luan was thinking. "It's nothing. It's just that my family has some power. I have dealt with trash like him since I was young." Qin Xian didn't hide his family background in front of Xiao Luan. However, in response to Qin Xian's words, Xiao Luan didn't have much of an expression. She remained calm and only said a few words. "Thank you." Regardless of whether it was necessary, Qin Xian had helped her. Therefore, Xiao Luan still thanked him. However, Qin Xian naturally wasn't satisfied with this. Seeing that Xiao Luan was about to leave, Qin Xian hurriedly followed up. "I still don't know your name." "Xiao Luan." Hearing this, Xiao Luan didn't hide her name this time and told Qin Xian her name. After hearing Xiao Luan's words, Qin Xian didn't think too much about it. He didn't even think about Xiaochen. After all, there were so many people with the surname Xiao in the Great Thousand World. Qin Xian, who had been following Xiao Luan, invited her enthusiastically. "Xiao Luan, why don't we travel together? This way, we can take care of each other. Don't worry, if you encounter any danger, I will definitely protect you." Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of this chapter. Chapter 22-21. Qin Xian was like a dogskin plaster that stuck to Xiao Luan. Xiao Luan's attitude towards him was neither warm nor cold. Xiao Luan didn't like Qin Xian at all. Although Qin Xian could be considered a genius, it wasn't enough to catch Xiao Luan's attention. Xiao Luan had known a lot of people since she was young. Not to mention her father, Xiaochen, there were many disciples in the sword sect that didn't belong to Qin Xian. In terms of talent, Qin Xian wasn't considered the top in the sword sect. Therefore, Xiao Luan naturally wouldn't treat Qin Xian differently like other women. It was the first time he met such a woman. However, the colder Xiao Luan was, the more Qin Xian wanted to attract her attention. The two walked side by side. Behind them, Qin Xian's companions followed closely. Along the way, Qin Xian took good care of Xiao Luan and didn't do anything out of the ordinary. However, Qin Xian didn't know that his every move was being watched by several pairs of eyes. Through the mirror, Qin Shuru and the other women, as well as Bai Ruyue, saw Qin Xian and frowned. As experienced people, how could they not know that Qin Xian wanted to pursue Xiao Luan? However, Xiao Luan was the little princess of the Xiao clan. Qin Shuru and the other women wouldn't be careless about Xiao Luan's marriage. Qin Shuru's eyes flashed with a strange light. Soon, she summoned a Swords Gate elder, pointed at Qin Xian on the mirror, and said, "Investigate this person's identity." However, when he saw Xiao Luan on the mirror, he was slightly taken aback and looked at Xiao Chen in surprise. "Xiao Luan, you're right. You're right. You're right. You're right." The elder didn't know that Xiao Luan was also participating in the recruitment. However, since Xiao Chen didn't mention it, it was obvious that he didn't want too many people to know. Therefore, the elder naturally understood what he meant. After being stunned for a moment, the elder quickly left the courtyard and began to investigate Qin Xian's background. It was not difficult for the Sword Sect to investigate a person. Therefore, in just an hour, all of Qin Xian's information was presented to Qin Shiru and the other girls. Qin Shiru and the other women frowned as they read the detailed records of Qin Xian's childhood. Hong Xiu even said indifferently, "The Qin family? A disciple of a small family?" The Qin family, which everyone thought was powerful, was just a small family in Hong Xiu's eyes. This was normal. After all, with Hong Xiu's status, she naturally looked down on the Qin family. The young master of the Qin clan was naturally not worthy of Xiao Luan. As soon as he finished speaking, the girls couldn't help but look at Xiao Chen. After all, this kind of matter still depended on Xiao Chen's opinion. Faced with the girls' gazes, Xiao Chen, who was drinking with Xiao Qing, said helplessly, "We don't have to care about children's matters. Let them settle it themselves." Luan Luan is no longer a child. Xiao Chen naturally saw Qin Xian's admiration for Xiao Luan. However, Xiao Chen didn't care too much about it. Moreover, Qin Xian hadn't done anything out of line, so Xiao Chen naturally didn't want to care about it. Seeing Xiao Chen's indifference, Qin Shiru and the other women rolled their eyes at him. Then, the girls gathered together and discussed various matters regarding Qin Xian. Qin Xian obviously didn't know that all of his information had been placed in front of Qin Shiru and the other women. He also didn't know that the family background he was proud of was not worth mentioning in the eyes of Qin Shiru and the other women. In the Demon's Plane, everything went smoothly. Xiao Luan had already obtained the token and the rest of the time was obviously more relaxed. 3 days later, Qin Xian and the rest had also obtained their tokens. Everyone found a place to rest and prepared to wait for the end of the first round of the grand competition. Qin Xian and Xiao Luan sat around a fire by a lake. To be precise, Qin Xian had been pestering Xiao Luan. He even specially hunted a demonic beast and barbecued it for Xiao Luan. The dignified young master of the Qin clan actually barbecued meat for a woman. If this news were to spread to the Qin clan, many people's jaws would drop. However, Xiao Luan didn't seem to be excited at all. She still appeared cold. Perhaps he was used to Xiao Luan's attitude, so Qin Xian didn't mind at all. He still enjoyed it. They waited idly for the end of the first round of the grand competition. In the next few days, Xiao Luan and the rest didn't encounter any danger. However, as time passed, the competition in the Demon's Plane became more intense. Many of the young warriors who participated in the recruitment competition also fought, and there were even cases of deaths. Of course, this was nothing strange. Moreover, at the beginning, the Swords Gate had already said that there would definitely be deaths in this recruitment competition. There were only 10,000 tokens in total. However, there were more than 100,000 warriors who participated in the grand competition. There were too many monks and too little meat. Naturally, competition was unavoidable. Even Xiao Luan and the rest encountered a few fights. However, Qin Xian was always there to protect them. This guy wasn't bad. He said that he would protect Xiao Luan and he did it. In fact, with Qin Xian's strength, he was already considered a top-notch existence among the warriors who participated in the grand competition. In addition to his reputation as the young master of the Qin clan, there weren't many who dared to provoke him. With Qin Xian's protection, Xiao Luan didn't encounter any danger. He didn't even need to fight. As such, 7 days passed quickly. Everyone left the Demon's Plane. Among them, those who obtained tokens were naturally overjoyed. As for those who didn't obtain tokens, they chose to leave dejectedly. Outside the demon's plane, the two Sword Sect elders from 7 days ago appeared again and announced that the second round of the grand competition would be held in 3 days. As such, those who obtained tokens and passed the first round were given 3 days to rest. Regarding this, Qin Xian invited Xiaoluan warmly. "Xiaoluan, where do you live? Why don't you follow me to the East Sword City? My clan has a villa there." Around the Sword Sect, there were 4 newly built cities. The East Sword City was one of them. As the Qin clan was a big clan in the Great Thousand World, it wasn't strange for them to have a villa in the East Sword City. Faced with Qin Xian's invitation, Xiaoluan thought about it and agreed. It had been a long time since Xiaoluan went out to play. Xiaoluan naturally didn't want to go back. Furthermore, Xiaochen had promised that he wouldn't restrict Xiaoluan's freedom in this grand competition. As such, Xiaoluan naturally seized the opportunity to play. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 22-22. Qin Xian was overjoyed to see Xiaoluan nodding in agreement. She immediately brought Xiaoluan to the East Sword City. Qin Xian was elated to see Xiaoluan nodding in agreement. She immediately brought Xiaoluan to the East Sword City. Xiaoluan wanted to go out and have some fun. Qin Shuru and the other ladies who had been paying attention to her couldn't stand it. They came to Xiao Chen's side and spoke at once. "Hubby, Luan is going to the East Sword City. Aren't you going to take care of her?" It was apparent that Qin Shuru and the other ladies weren't willing to let Xiaoluan go to the East Sword City. They didn't want Xiaoluan to stay in the Qin family. After all, in their eyes, how could the young master of the Qin family be worthy of Luan? However, Xiaochen forced a smile. "All right, Luan isn't a child anymore. Besides, I've promised her that I won't restrict her freedom during the competition. You can't expect me to go back on my words, right?" Xiaochen wasn't worried about Xiaoluan's safety at all. What a joke! Would anything happen to her at her own home? Then the Sword Sect would really live up to its reputation. Xiaochen didn't mind at all. Qin Shuru and the other ladies rolled their eyes at Xiaochen. Then, they ignored Xiaochen and went to the side to have a discussion. Xiaochen didn't know what Qin Shuru and the other ladies were discussing. He let out a helpless sigh and muttered under his breath. "Sigh, what a loving mother, wasn't your mother like this when you were young?" Xiao Qing scolded with a smile. Qin Shuru and the other ladies were unusually nervous about Luan. Wasn't Bairua the same when Xiaochen was young? All mothers in the world were the same. Hearing his father's words, Xiaochen didn't refute. Forget it, let them be. Anyway, with how nervous they were about Luan, Xiaochen knew that no matter what he said, they wouldn't listen. While the ladies were worried about Xiaoluan had already arrived at Eastern Sword City under Qin Xian's lead. Xiaoluan was naturally familiar with Eastern Sword City. She had followed her mothers here many times. It could be said that Xiaoluan was much more familiar with Eastern Sword City than Qin Xian. Once she entered East Sword City, Xiaoluan quickly walked into the city according to her memory. She remembered that there was a shop in East Sword City that sold tangulu that was especially delicious. Last time, Second Mother 100 Flower Fairy had bought it for Xiaoluan. Not knowing where Xiaoluan was going, Qin Xian naturally followed closely behind. However, a young man beside him whispered to Qin Xian, "Young master, is it appropriate for us to bring her home? After all, the Qin family isn't a place where just anyone can enter." Admittedly, Xiaoluan was very beautiful. However, it was inappropriate for Qin Xian to bring her home just because of that. After all, the Qin family wasn't a place where just anyone could enter. Hearing this, Qin Xian's expression darkened. "It's not up to you to interfere in my matters." He knew what this person meant. However, after interacting with Xiaoluan for a few days, Qin Xian discovered that he had indeed fallen in love with this woman. Not only because of Xiao Luan's appearance, but also because of Xiao Luan's personality and the feeling she gave him. He had never felt this way before. Qin Xian was certain that he had truly fallen in love with Xiao Luan. With a low shout, Qin Xian hurriedly chased after Xiao Luan. Following which, the two of them passed through the main street and arrived at a small alley. Just as they entered the alley, they saw a Tanghulu shop. The shop wasn't big. It could even be said that it was very small. However, seeing the shop, Xiao Luan happily ran up and said to the old man selling Tanghulu, "Grandpa, I want 2 Tanghulu skewers." This old man didn't have any cultivation. He was just an ordinary person. However, the Tanghulu he made tasted amazing. At the very least, Xiao Luan liked it very much. The old man gave off a very kind feeling. When he heard Xiao Luan's request, he smiled and said, "Okay." Soon, he passed 2 Tanghulu skewers to Xiao Luan and said, "Little girl, why didn't your mother come with you this time?" It was obvious that the old man still remembered Xiao Luan. It couldn't be helped. Both mother and daughter were extremely beautiful. It was indeed difficult for people to forget them. Xiao Luan took the Tanghulu skewers and said with a smile, "Second mother is at home. I came alone this time." After saying that, she waved her hand at the old man and left. Following which, she brought the Tanghulu skewers to Qin Xian and handed one to him. "Try it. The Tanghulu skewers here are pretty good. Mother brought me here to eat it last time. I really liked it." After spending a few days with Qin Xian, the two of them gradually became familiar with each other. However, Xiao Luan didn't have any feelings for Qin Xian. Perhaps it could be said that Xiao Luan's personality was the same as Xiao Chen's. They belonged to the type of people who didn't care about anything. Until now, Xiao Luan still didn't feel any feelings for Qin Xian. She only treated Qin Xian as an ordinary friend. The reason why she gave Qin Xian a Tanghulu skewers was because she treated him as a friend. However, Qin Xian didn't think so. After receiving the Tanghulu skewers from Xiao Luan, Qin Xian immediately said happily, "Okay, I'll try it." Looking at the happy smile on Xiao Luan's face and the 2 dimples on her cheeks, Qin Xian was stunned for a moment. As he ate the Tanghulu skewers, he strolled around the city with Xiao Luan. Qin Xian admitted that he liked to be with Xiao Luan. No matter what he did, as long as he was with Xiao Luan, he would feel very happy. The two of them strolled around the eastern Sword City. When they saw that the sky was gradually darkening, Qin Xian also suggested that they return. With regards to this, Xiao Luan did not say anything. Under Qin Xian's strong invitation, she followed him to the Qin clan's other courtyard. The Qin family's courtyard in the East Sword City wasn't small. The location was also quite good. From this, one could see the Qin family's wealth. After all, the houses in the East Sword City weren't cheap. This was especially so for a courtyard with such a good location and size. The price was even higher. Moreover, this was only one of the Qin family's courtyards. However, Xiao Luan didn't care about this. She naturally followed Qin Xian into the courtyard. However, just as they arrived at the front courtyard, they saw a middle-aged man walking towards them. When Qin Xian saw this middle-aged man, he opened his mouth and called out, "Second uncle." This person was Qin Xian's second uncle. This time, he had specially accompanied Qin Xian to the sword sect to participate in the recruitment competition. When he heard Qin Xian's words, his second uncle nodded his head slightly. After which, he turned his gaze towards Xiao Luan and said with some displeasure, "Xianer, who is she?" "Second uncle, she is my friend. Her name is Xiao Luan." When Qin Xian heard this, he smiled and said. Seeing this, Xiao Luan also politely greeted him. However, Qin Xian's second uncle ignored Xiao Luan's politeness. At the same time, he said to Qin Xian with some displeasure, "Xianer, it's not that I want to nag you, but you should know that we have important matters to attend to in the Sword Mansion. This isn't the time to talk about love. Moreover, you should know the rules of the family. Not just anyone can be brought home. If your father finds out, he will definitely beat you up. Chapter 22-23. Qin Xian's second uncle clearly didn't like Xiao Luan. In his opinion, Qin Xian shouldn't be focusing on a woman right now. Instead, he should be focusing on preparing for the recruitment competition, especially in the third round. It would be best if he could obtain a good result. Qin Xian's second uncle clearly didn't like Xiao Luan. In his opinion, Qin Xian shouldn't be focusing on a woman right now. Instead, he should be focusing on preparing for the recruitment competition, especially in the third round. It would be best if he could obtain a good result. It was undeniable that Xiao Luan was very beautiful, but so what? There were so many beauties in the world. As the young master of the Qin clan, how could he ruin his plans for a woman? In front of Xiao Luan, Qin Xian's second uncle didn't show any mercy. His words were also extremely unpleasant. Hearing this, Qin Xian immediately said with some displeasure, "Second uncle, what are you saying? Xiao Luan is my friend. It's not what you think. I don't care. You have to know your mission as the young master of the Qin clan. In addition, you have to know that since you are the young master of the Qin clan, not just anyone can be your woman in the future. After all, she is the mistress of the Qin clan." Qin Xian's second uncle didn't back down. It was obvious that Qin Xian's second uncle treated Xiao Luan as an ordinary person without any background. Qin Xian still wanted to say something, but Xiao Luan spoke first. "Qin Xian, I think I should go back. By the way, thank you for playing with me today. I'm very happy." Although Xiao Luan was a little insensitive like Xiaochen, she wasn't a fool. Since Qin Xian's second uncle was so obvious, Xiao Luan naturally felt that he didn't welcome her. Since that was the case, Xiao Luan naturally wouldn't ask for a rebuff. Moreover, to be honest, Xiao Luan wasn't very interested in the Qin clan. She didn't have any intention of climbing up the social ladder of the Qin clan. What a joke! As the little princess of the sword sect, did Xiao Luan need to climb up the social ladder of the Qin clan? She wondered what Qin Xian's second uncle would think if he knew Xiao Luan's identity. Would he regret what he did today? It was obviously a good opportunity to form a relationship with the sword sect. If Qin Xian could have a relationship with Xiao Luan, it would be much better than Qin Xian joining the sword sect. Unfortunately, Qin Xian's second uncle had destroyed this possibility. However, Xiao Luan wasn't angry. At the same time, he didn't want to use his power to bully others. Under the guidance of Xiaochen, Xiao Luan never used his family background to bully others. Xiao Luan had never done such a thing. This time, Xiao Luan did not give Qin Xian a chance to speak. He turned around and left. Seeing this, Qin Xian glanced at his second uncle in displeasure. However, he did not say anything. After all, the other party was his elder. He quickly chased after Xiao Luan. When Qin Xian arrived at the entrance of the Qin residence, he caught up with Xiao Luan. Looking at Xiao Luan's calm expression, Qin Xian didn't know if she was angry. "Xiao Luan, I'm sorry. I think my second uncle might have misunderstood something." "It's fine, Xiao Luan smiled. She didn't take this matter to heart. But before Xiao Luan finished her sentence, she heard a pleasant voice calling out to her from afar. "Luan Luan." Looking in the direction of the voice, Qin Xian saw a beautiful woman in a purple dress walking over leisurely. At first glance, Qin Xian was stunned on the spot. It was the first time he saw such a beautiful woman in this world. She was so beautiful that it gave people a surreal feeling. While Qin Xian was in a daze, Xiao Luan ran toward the beautiful woman in the purple dress and called out happily. "Second mother, why are you here?" The woman was none other than Hundred Flower Fairy. After a round of discussion, they decided that they couldn't let Xiao Luan spend the night in the Qin residence, so Hundred Flower Fairy personally came to East Sword City. It was fortunate that Bai Hua Fairy had arrived a little late, otherwise, if she had seen how Qin Xian's second uncle looked down on Xiao Luan, the Qin clan would have faced the wrath of the Swords Gate matriarch. Xiaoluan jumped into 100 Flower Fairy's embrace happily. 100 Flower Fairy caressed Xiaoluan's head affectionately and scolded with a smile. "You're not home all day and only know how to run around. Do you know how worried your mothers are about you? They asked me to come pick you up." Second mother. Xiaoluan revealed a pitiful look after being scolded by 100 Flower Fairy. 100 Flower Fairy smiled helplessly. "All right, you mischievous girl. Let's go home." Since 100 Flower Fairy had personally come to East Sword City, Xiaoluan naturally had to return home. In response, Xiaoluan could only nod his head unwillingly. However, before he left, Xiaoluan turned his head and waved goodbye to Qin Xian. "Qin Xian, see you in the second round of the grand competition." After saying that, she disappeared into the crowd under 100 Flower Fairy's lead. From the beginning to the end, 100 Flower Fairy didn't even look at Qin Xian. Apparently, he was completely ignored. With 100 Flower Fairy's status, it was natural that she wouldn't care about a mere young master of the Qin family. Even if the Qin family's ancestor came, 100 Flower Fairy wouldn't even give him a second glance. After watching 100 Flower Fairy and Xiaoluan leave, Qin Xian finally murmured after a long while. "Is that Xiaoluan's mother?" From 100 Flower Fairy, other than her beautiful appearance, what touched Qin Xian the most was the temperament that 100 Flower Fairy unconsciously exuded. It was a temperament that belonged to someone who had been in a high position for a long time. Such a temperament made Qin Xian not dare to look directly at 100 Flower Fairy, as if she was the queen of the heavens. At the same time, 100 Flower Fairy also made Qin Xian feel a great pressure. This pressure had nothing to do with cultivation. Moreover, Qin Xian had never felt this kind of pressure even from his own father. Unaware of Qin Xian's thoughts, after following 100 Flower Fairy back to the Sword Sect, Xiaoluan was naturally taught a lesson by Qin Shuru and the other girls. The girls all loved their daughter dearly. In the end, it was Xiaochen who spoke up, allowing Xiaoluan to escape. In the next few days, Xiaoluan was naturally unable to leave the Sword Sect. 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. Today, it was time for the second round of the competition. After the first round of eliminations, the number of people in the second round was obviously much lower. There were only a mere 10,000 people. Furthermore, for the second round of the grand competition, Swords Gate had built a battle arena in a separate small world for the second round of the grand competition. The participants would be fighting there for the second round of the grand competition. Qin Xian and Qin Xian's second uncle entered the pocket dimension. Qin Xian's second uncle went directly to the spectator seats. However, wherever he went, many people would take the initiative to greet him. Although the Qin clan's power and influence could not be compared to the Sword Sect, it was still not something that those small factions could compare to. Qin Xian's second uncle smiled and nodded in response to everyone's compliments. Then, he went to a seat closer to the front and sat down, waiting for the competition to begin. Chapter 22-24. The second round of the competition was also conducted in the form of a single elimination tournament, but it was a battle of life and death. The second round of the competition was also conducted in the form of a single elimination tournament, but it was a battle of life and death. 10,000 Kadian sect disciples who had committed a capital offense had already been selected. Of course, their cultivation levels were also selected, and they were basically at the same level as the young martial artists who were participating in the recruitment competition this time. Because of this, spectators were allowed to watch the second round of the competition. For example, Qin Xian's second uncle, many of the family elders who had followed these young martial artists to participate in the recruitment competition also came to the spectator seats and took their seats. With the identity of Qin Xian's second uncle, he was naturally respected and flattered by many people. However, his seat was not in the first row but in the second row. As for the first row, it was reserved for the elders of the Sword Sect. Even with the identity of Qin Xian's second uncle, it was naturally impossible for him to be on equal footing with the elders of the Sword Sect. Moreover, it was said that Vice Sect leader Lin Qing would personally host the second round of the competition. Although Lin Qing was only one of the Vice Sect leaders of the Sword Sect, he held great power. It was no exaggeration to say that the power of any of the Vice Sect leaders of the Sword Sect was definitely much greater than the so-called Qing clan's patriarch. Therefore, everyone was looking forward to Vice Sect leader Lin Qing personally hosting the second round of the competition. After all, he was the Vice Sect leader of the Sword Sect. Everyone would be satisfied if they could exchange a few words with him. The spectator seats were already packed. Below, in the preparation area, the 10,000 young martial artists who had passed the first round of the competition were already preparing. Everyone knew that their opponents were the disciples of the Kadian sect. Although they might be the lowest outer court disciples of the Kadian sect, they were not to be underestimated. After all, the Kadian sect was once one of the 10 great Lingtian sects. Their disciples were obviously not a bunch of good-for-nothings. Lin Qing's idea of using the disciples of the heavenly sect to test the new disciples was indeed a good idea. Because in this way, it would prove that the new disciples of the Sword Sect were obviously stronger than those of the heavenly sect. As for the word cruel, it was simply a joke. The winner was king while the loser was in the wrong. Since the heavenly sect had lost, wouldn't their disciples be at the mercy of the Sword's Gate? Therefore, there was nothing cruel about it. Furthermore, the hands of these heavenly sect disciples were also stained with the blood of the Sword's Gate disciples. While they were preparing for the upcoming battle, Qin Xian anxiously searched for Xiao Luan's figure. After searching for a while, Qin Xian saw Xiao Luan and immediately went up to greet her happily. Xiao Luan. Qin Xian called out with a smile. Upon hearing Qin Xian's voice, Xiao Luan waved her hand. However, just as the two of them greeted each other, an extremely untimely voice interrupted the conversation between the two of them. "Yo, Qin Xian. Which family's young lady are you trying to trick this time?" The voice was filled with thick mockery. Qin Xian turned to the voice and saw a young man dressed in luxurious clothes striding toward him. Qin Xian immediately snapped at the young man. "Zhang Xian, are you trying to pick a fight?" It was apparent that Qin Xian knew Zhang Xian and their relationship didn't seem to be harmonious. In fact, the Zhang family that Zhang Xian belonged to was also a large family. In terms of strength, it wasn't much weaker than the Qin family. Moreover, the Qin family and the Zhang family weren't far apart and there had always been conflicts between the two families. Therefore, as the young masters of the two families and geniuses with extraordinary talents, Qin Xian and Zhang Xian had always disliked each other since they were young. Qin Xian knew that Zhang Xian was participating in the Sword Sect's recruitment competition, which was why he wasn't surprised to see Zhang Xian here. However, it wasn't easy for Qin Xian to speak to Xiao Luan, and Zhang Xian came over to mess things up. This made Qin Xian extremely unhappy. As expected, the smile on Xiao Luan's face quickly disappeared upon seeing Zhang Xian. She said to Qin Xian indifferently, "I'll be leaving first." She didn't wait for Qin Xian's reply and left immediately. Qin Xian was inwardly vexed as he gazed at Zhang Xian's back view. Don't pick a fight for no reason. Then, he turned around and left. This wasn't the place to make a move. After all, Qin Xian was in the Sword Sect and he didn't dare to provoke the Sword Sect's prestige. Qin Xian and Xiao Luan left. However, Zhang Xian didn't care about this at all. He only looked at Xiao Luan's back view and revealed a faint smile. What a beautiful lady. Qin Xian, it seems like I'll have to snatch her away again. Xiao Luan didn't know what Zhang Xian was thinking. Even if she knew, she probably wouldn't care. With Xiao Luan's status, if Zhang Xian dared to do anything out of line, the entire Zhang family would be buried with him. Therefore, if Zhang Xian had some self-awareness, he wouldn't have done something that he shouldn't have. Zhang Xian's appearance didn't affect Xiao Luan at all. Although Qin Xian still wanted to look for Xiao Luan, he gave up on the idea after some thought. He could only curse Zhang Xian in his heart. Zhang Xian's appearance was only a small interlude. Very quickly, the second round of the competition began. There were a total of 10 stages according to their respective numbers, and the competition would be held in all 10 stages at the same time. One by one, the young martial artists whose names were called stepped onto the battle ring and began the second round of the competition. Compared to the first round, the second round of the competition was obviously more dangerous because the disciples of the heavenly sect wouldn't hold back. They would use their killing moves as soon as they attacked. It was either life or death. Therefore, as soon as the competition began, there were already people who fell. Of course, there were also disciples of the heavenly sect who were killed. But no matter what, the second round of the competition was obviously more brutal than the first. Battle after battle continued. While the battles were going on the 7th arena, a battle had just ended. When the referee, who was acting as the referee, glanced at the name list, he was stunned. This was because the name list stated that the next participant was Xiao Luan. The judge knew who Xiao Luan was. She was the daughter of the sect leader. But, taken aback, the deacon instinctively called out. Xiao Luan. Hearing her name, Xiao Luan strode onto stage 7. However, when Xiao Luan appeared on stage 7, Lin Qing, who was sitting on the main seat, stood up abruptly. When he saw Xiao Luan on stage 7, Lin Qing exclaimed in surprise. Miss. Lin Qing was obviously shocked by Xiao Luan's appearance. Not only him, but the surrounding elders of Swords Gate were also dumbfounded at this moment. Please add me to your collection. Please recommend me. End of chapter. Chapter 22-25. Xiao Luan's appearance made Lin Qing and the other experts of the Sword sect extremely nervous. They were very clear about Xiao Luan's identity. She was the apple of Xiao Chen's eye. If anything were to happen to her, Xiao Chen would definitely skin them alive. Xiao Luan's appearance made Lin Qing and the other experts of the Sword sect extremely nervous. They were very clear about Xiao Luan's identity. She was the apple of Xiao Chen's eye. If anything were to happen to her, Xiao Chen would definitely skin them alive. They didn't dare to be careless. Lin Qing even had the thought of stopping the competition. However, just as Lin Qing was hesitating, a golden light from a sound transmission talisman entered the space between Lin Qing's eyebrows. The sound transmission talisman was sent by Xiao Chen. The content was very simple. It was just a single sentence. It was clear that he didn't want Xiao Luan to affect the recruitment competition. At the same time, he didn't want Xiao Luan's identity to be exposed. He also didn't want Lin Qing to give Xiao Luan any preferential treatment because of her identity. After receiving Xiao Chen's message, Lin Qing quickly understood Xiao Chen's intentions. It was clear that Xiao Chen wanted to train Xiao Luan. Lin Qing could only forcefully suppress the worry in his heart. He nodded slightly at the deacon on the 7th arena. Seeing this, the deacon ordered the disciples of the heavenly sect to enter the arena. Lin Qing completely obeyed Xiao Chen's orders. However, his eyes were still fixed on the 7th arena. Although Xiao Chen's intentions were very clear, Lin Qing naturally didn't dare to be careless. He couldn't let anything happen to Xiao Luan. Therefore, he had been paying attention to every movement on the 7th arena. It would be best if Xiao Luan could win. However, if Xiao Luan was in danger, Lin Qing would definitely save her immediately. Lin Qing was secretly observing everything that was happening in the 7th arena. As for the Swords Gate Elder's strange behavior, not many people noticed it. After all, Lin Qing and the others were very good at concealing themselves. Ordinary people wouldn't be able to see through them. Under Lin Qing's secret observation, a heavenly sect disciple was brought up to the 7th arena. Obviously, he already knew that he was going to die. Therefore, when he looked at Xiao Luan, this heavenly sect disciple did not have the slightest hesitation. In any case, it was better to drag someone down with him. Looking at Xiao Luan without restraint, this heavenly gate disciple sneered, "Tisk tsk, a little beauty. Seems like my luck is not bad, to be able to have a beauty as a companion before I die." In the face of a predestined outcome, many disciples of the heavenly sect had nothing to fear, so they naturally had nothing to be afraid of. An icy glint gradually surfaced in Xiao Wan's eyes when she saw the heavenly coiling sect's disciple brazenly sizing her up. Because of Xiaochen, Xiao Wan did not have a good impression of the heavenly coiling sect. Naturally, Xiao Wan would not feel any pity for this heavenly coiling sect's disciple. After removing the seal on the heavenly sect's disciple's cultivation, the aura of a perfected celestial emperor instantly soared into the sky. His cultivation was at the same level as Xiao Wan. With a sneer, the heavenly sect's disciple did not give Xiao Wan any time to prepare. Without hesitation, he attacked Xiao Wan. His eyes were brimming with killing intent as he said, "Die." Xiao Wan's expression did not change in the face of the heavenly sect's disciple's attack. She tilted her body and dodged the attack. At the same time, a long sword appeared in her hand from her storage ring. This long sword was given to Xiao Wan by Xiaochen. It was extraordinary. With the long sword in hand, Xiao Wan's aura became even sharper. She slashed out with the sword and shouted coldly, "Green Lotus Sword Chi." Following Xiao Wan's shout, a green sword ray shot towards the heavenly sect's disciple at lightning speed. The Green Lotus Sword Chi was Xiao Chen's signature celestial skill. Naturally, he had imparted it to Xiao Wan. Moreover, Xiao Wan had long cultivated the Green Lotus Sword Chi to the perfected stage. When the terrifying green sword ray flashed out, the heavenly sect's disciple's eyes turned solemn. However, he did not choose to dodge the attack. Instead, he chose to take it head-on. Once again, he threw out a punch. Similarly, he also used his signature celestial skill. Both of them collided violently. In the end, the heavenly sect's disciple was sent flying. The outcome of the collision was obvious. It was clear that Xiao Wan was stronger. Lin Qing, who was sitting on the main seat, heaved a sigh of relief when she saw this. Since Xiao Wan was stronger than the heavenly sect's disciple, as long as Xiao Wan did not underestimate her opponent, she should not be in any danger. After being sent flying by Xiao Wan's sword, before the heavenly sect's disciple could regain his balance, Xiao Wan immediately executed the absolute Yin movement technique. She did not give the heavenly sect's disciple any time to react. She quickly caught up with the heavenly sect's disciple and did not show any mercy. Xiao Wan continuously slashed out 3 times. Facing Xiao Wan's attack, the heavenly sect's disciple tried his best to resist. Unfortunately, he was not strong enough and was killed by Xiao Wan in the end. The outcome of the battle had been determined. Xiao Wan's performance naturally attracted the attention of many people, including Qin Xian's second uncle. Qin Xian's second uncle naturally knew Xiao Wan. They had just met 3 days ago. However, at that time, Qin Xian's second uncle thought that Xiao Wan was not worthy of Qin Xian. Therefore, he did not show any mercy. However, looking at it now, Xiao Wan's strength was already extraordinary. I wonder what her family background is like. If she is from an ordinary family, she is still not worthy of Qin Xian. Qin Xian's second uncle thought inwardly. As such, Qin Xian's second uncle could not help but take another look at Xiao Wan. He still thought that Xiao Wan was not worthy of Qin Xian. However, Qin Xian's second uncle had never thought that it was not Xiao Wan who was not worthy of Qin Xian. Instead, it was Qin Xian who was worthy of Xiao Wan. In terms of family background, Xiao Wan was simply miles ahead of Qin Xian. After the battle ended, the deacon of the 7th arena let out a sigh of relief. At least Xiao Wan did not suffer any injuries. He immediately announced the result. Xiao Wan had successfully passed the second round of the competition by killing his opponent. It could be said that Xiao Wan had successfully joined the sword sect with his own strength. However, Xiao Wan's goal was obviously not limited to this. If he wanted his father, Xiaochen, to have a whole new level of respect for him, Xiao Wan would need to achieve a good result in the 3rd round of the competition. It would be best if he could come out on top. Moreover, Xiaochen would be there in person for the 3rd round of the competition. Xiao Wan was even more reluctant to embarrass himself in front of his father. Otherwise, all the bold words he had said back then would become a joke. He must achieve a good result in the third round of the competition. With this thought in mind, Xiao Luan walked down from the arena with a calm expression. He did not seem to be excited about passing the second round of the competition. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendation. End of chapter. Chapter 22-26. Xiao Luan easily defeated her opponent and walked down the stage. Xiao Luan was about to leave, but after taking a few steps, Qin Xian, who had also just finished his battle, came looking for her. Xiao Luan easily defeated her opponent and walked down the stage. Xiao Luan was about to leave, but after taking a few steps, Qin Xian, who had also just finished his battle, came looking for her. Qin Xian had also defeated his opponent. With Qin Xian's strength, this wasn't surprising. After all, the Qin clan had spent a lot of effort on Qin Xian since he was young. Therefore, it wasn't too difficult for him to defeat an ordinary heavenly sect outer disciple. After the battle, Qin Xian hurriedly came looking for Xiao Luan. With a smile on his face, he said, "Xiao Luan, congratulations. Now we are brothers and sisters." Qin Xian was really happy that Xiao Luan had successfully passed the second round of the competition. This way, he could enter the sword sect with Xiao Luan. In the future, they would all be disciples of the sword sect and would be brothers and sisters. As the saying goes, the pavilion closest to the water enjoys the moonlight first. Since they were both disciples of the sword sect, Qin Xian's chances of wooing Xiao Luan were obviously much higher. However, Xiao Luan wasn't too excited in the face of Qin Xian's congratulations. She only said indifferently, "Didn't you win too?" Hearing Xiao Luan's words, Qin Xian smiled and invited Xiao Luan to the East Sword City again. However, this time, Xiao Luan rejected. Previously, when they went to the East Sword City, Qin Shuru's second uncle's attitude had already made everything clear. Xiao Luan naturally wouldn't ask for a rebuff. Moreover, after being brought home by her second mother, 100 Flower Fairy, Qin Shuru and the other girls didn't allow Xiao Luan to go out alone. Xiao Luan was helpless about this. Qin Xian was a little disappointed and felt a little guilty at the same time. "Xiao Luan, I'm sorry. My second uncle is like this. He has a sharp tongue but a soft heart. Please don't take what happened last time to heart." Qin Xian explained, thinking that Xiao Luan was still brooding over her second uncle's matter. However, Xiao Luan shook her head and said, "It doesn't matter. My mother didn't allow me to go out." As for Qin Xian's second uncle, Xiao Luan didn't take it to heart. Given their identities, it was destined that they wouldn't have much interaction, so there was no need to take it to heart. After hearing Xiao Luan's words, Qin Xian could only helplessly nod. Qin Xian, after all, since Zhao's mother didn't allow Xiao Luan to go out, what could he say? After all, the two of them had already passed the second round and were almost certain to enter Sword's Gate. The third round was merely a ranking competition. And Qin Xian's second uncle to the entrance, Qin's twos to the door to the door to the door, twos. And Qin, of course, Xiao. And was for him, of course to enter was to the point, to the talk to him, to the was to chat, thought, to the was for. Lin Qing was naturally here because of Xiao Luan. However, when he saw Xiao Luan and Qin Xian appear together, Lin Qing was stunned. Looking at Qin Xian's appearance, Lin Qing quickly guessed that Qin Xian was probably pursuing Xiao Luan. As an experienced person, Lin Qing naturally saw through the clues at a glance. However, what Lin Qing did not expect was that before he could speak, Qin Xian's second uncle had already spoken first. "Xianer, this is Vice Sect Leader Lin Qing. Hurry up and greet him. And you, little girl, greet him as well." Qin Xian's second uncle wanted to introduce Lin Qing to Qin Xian. He even called Xiao Luan along. Lin Qing's eyes flashed with displeasure when he heard Qin Xian's second uncle's words. It was because Qin Xian's second uncle's tone was filled with disdain when he spoke to Xiao Luan. Qin Xian's second uncle didn't know Xiao Luan's identity. In Lin Qing's eyes, his actions were simply courting death. However, Xiao Luan still didn't give Lin Qing a chance to speak. She came in front of Lin Qing and bowed respectfully. "Greetings, Vice Sect Leader." As she spoke, she secretly made a funny face at Lin Qing. Lin Qing understood that Xiao Luan did not want to reveal his identity. After which, Qin Xian also hurriedly bowed. His attitude was very respectful and reverent. Lin Qing didn't reveal Xiao Luan's identity when the two young men bowed. However, Lin Qing's second uncle's next sentence made Lin Qing laugh. Qin Xian's second uncle introduced Xiao Luan to Lin Qing. "Vice Sect Leader Lin Qing, this is my elder brother's only son, Qin Xian. He is here to participate in the recruitment competition. As for Xiao Luan, she is my nephew's girlfriend. I hope Vice Sect Leader Lin Qing can take care of her." He directly described Xiao Luan as Qin Xian's girlfriend. Lin Qing was stunned when he heard this. He then looked at Xiao Luan with a strange expression and then looked at Qin Xian. It was undeniable that Qin Xian was handsome, but in Lin Qing's opinion, he was not worthy of Xiao Luan. Xiao Luan was the little princess of the Sword Sect. A mere young master of the Qin clan was nothing to her. However, Qin Xian's second uncle thought that Xiao Luan wasn't good enough for Qin Xian. When he talked about Xiao Luan, his tone was filled with disdain. If it wasn't for the fact that Xiao Chen and Xiao Luan didn't want to reveal their identities, Lin Qing would definitely teach Qin Xian's second uncle a lesson. However, he obviously couldn't do that now. As such, Lin Qing could only laugh dryly. "Haha, all right. I still have things to do. I won't stay any longer." After he finished speaking, Lin Qing walked away. He didn't give Qin Xian's second uncle any face. Qin Xian's second uncle naturally didn't dare to show any dissatisfaction. After Lin Qing left, Qin Xian's second uncle looked at Qin Xian and said, "Let's go." They still had to prepare for the third round. Although the third round was a ranking battle, the higher the ranking, the greater the benefits. Therefore, they couldn't afford to be careless. They completely ignored Xiao Luan. Before they left, Qin Xian bid farewell to Xiao Luan and left with his second uncle. After Qin Xian and his nephew left, Lin Qing, who had already left, appeared beside Xiao Luan again. He looked at Xiao Luan and said with a bitter smile, "Young miss, what are you up to this time?" "Uncle Lin, you can't expose my identity," Xiao Luan said with a smile. Xiao Luan was famous in the Sword Sect for being mischievous. However, it could be said that Lin Qing had watched Xiao Luan grow up. Therefore, Lin Qing doted on Xiao Luan like a senior to a junior. Qin Xian's second uncle's attitude made Lin Qing unhappy. However, when he saw Xiao Luan's pleading look, Lin Qing finally nodded helplessly. "All right, Uncle Lin won't speak nonsense. I know Uncle Lin is the best. All right, I'll go back now. Uncle Lin, you can continue with your work." Seeing that Lin Qing had agreed, Xiao Luan happily hugged Lin Qing and skipped away. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. End of chapter. Chapter 22-27. After easily passing the second round of the competition, Xiao Luan happily returned home. Qin Shuru and the other girls were also happy to see Xiao Luan return safely. After easily passing the second round of the competition, Xiao Luan happily returned home. Qin Shuru and the other girls were also happy to see Xiao Luan return safely. Qin Shuru and the other girls weren't too concerned about whether Xiao Luan passed the second round of the competition or not. As long as Xiao Luan was safe, that was enough for them. However, apart from worrying about Xiao Luan's safety, Qin Shuru and the other girls were also thinking about another matter, which was Qin Xian. They had already investigated Qin Xian thoroughly. Although Qin Xian didn't have any major misdeeds since he was young, and his reputation was very good. The most important thing was that he was clean and honest. He seemed like a good junior. It was obvious that Qin Xian adored Xiao Luan. However, Qin Shuru and the other girls weren't very optimistic about Qin Xian. First of all, the difference in status between the two was too big. However, in this regard, Xiaochen and Qin Shuru had a different opinion. According to Xiaochen, they shouldn't interfere in the affairs of the youngsters. As long as Qin Xian didn't do anything out of line, they should be allowed to develop on their own. Everything depended on their own fate. As for the final result, Xiaochen's idea was to let nature take its course. However, Qin Shuru and the other girls obviously disagreed. In the end, Xiaochen couldn't stand them and directly threw this matter to them. Anyway, Xiaochen had always been too lazy to care about such trivial matters. Unlike Xiaoluan, Qin Xian had been thinking about Xiaoluan ever since he returned to his residence with his second uncle. He didn't know why, but Xiaoluan's position in Qin Xian's heart was getting more and more important. Qin Xian didn't care about Xiaoluan's family background and other aspects, but Qin Xian's second uncle didn't think so. He had already ordered people to investigate Xiaoluan. However, there had been no news, which made Qin Xian's second uncle very puzzled. With the Qin family's means, it wasn't difficult to investigate a person's information. However, Xiaoluan was like a mystery that couldn't be investigated at all. With each of them having their own thoughts, the time for the third round of the ranking battle was quickly set. It would be held 3 days later, and this time, it would be held in the main square of the Sword Sect. There were a total of 7,000 people who passed the second round of the competition. The remaining 2,000 people failed. They were either killed by the disciples of the Heavenly Sect or were defeated by the disciples of the Heavenly Sect. Although they survived, they had no chance of becoming a disciple of the Sword Sect. 3 days passed quickly as they prepared for the third round of the ranking battles. On this day, over 7,000 young warriors who had passed the first 2 rounds of the ranking battles were finally able to enter the Sword Sect. After entering the Sword Sect, everyone curiously looked at everything around them. There were many young cultivators dressed in the Sword's Gate disciples' attire walking in and out of the pavilions. All of these made the young cultivators envious. The Sword Sect's environment was indeed picturesque. It was simply like a paradise on earth. Especially when facing the senior disciples wearing the Sword Sect's uniform, these young warriors were even more excited. Fortunately, after passing the first 2 rounds of the ranking battles, they could already be considered as disciples of the Sword Sect. Today's ranking battles were only to determine their strength ranking. Under the guidance of a person, everyone was brought to the main square. At this time, there were already 10 arenas built in the main square. The third round of the ranking battles would be held here. Similarly, people like Qin Xian's second uncle could also watch the battles from the side. The Sword Sect had specially set up seats for them and provided them with fine wine and delicacies. Compared to the first 2 rounds of the ranking battles, the atmosphere of the third round was obviously much more relaxed. After all, even the losers could enter the Sword Sect. As a result, the pressure in everyone's hearts was naturally much less. Without any pressure, many young warriors gathered together and chatted in groups of 3 to 5. Qin Xian naturally found Xiaoluan at the first moment. Seeing Xiaoluan, Qin Xian was obviously very happy. He didn't know why, but in any case, Qin Xian really liked being with Xiaoluan. Sitting in the audience, Qin Xian's second uncle looked at Xiaoluan who was chatting with Qin Xian. A trace of doubt involuntarily flashed through his eyes. Using the Qin clan's power, but in the end, they still couldn't find out Xiaoluan's identity. This made Qin Xian's second uncle extremely depressed. At the same time, he was secretly curious about Xiaoluan's identity. With the Qin clan's power, it was naturally impossible for them to find out anything if they wanted to investigate Qin Xian. Unless Qin Shuru and the other girls intentionally exposed Xiaoluan's identity, the Qin clan wouldn't be able to find any clues even if they investigated until the end. The competition soon began. The rules were obviously different from the first 2 rounds of the ranking battles. That was, no killing was allowed. Moreover, on each arena, there were dedicated Sword Sect deacons who were responsible for acting as referees. Of course, if necessary, they could intervene to prevent any deaths. The rules were obviously much softer, but this was normal. After all, over 7,000 young warriors present were basically new disciples of the sword sect. As such, it was obvious that they couldn't be casually killed. As usual, Lin Qing personally hosted the competition. After he loudly announced the start of the competition, all 10 arenas began to compete at the same time. The third round of the ranking battles was divided into 2 days. On the first day, the top 10 would be decided. On the second day, the top 10 would battle each other. As for Xiaochen, he would only appear the next day. Today, only Lin Qing hosted the competition. All 10 arenas began to compete at the same time. As the battles began and ended, Xiao Luan also stepped onto the arena. After a few battles, Xiao Luan finally determined the top 10. Successfully entering the top 10 wasn't too difficult for Xiao Luan. After all, he had been personally taught by Xiaochen since he was young. Xiao Luan's combat strength wasn't weak. It wasn't difficult for him to enter the top 10. At the same time, other than Xiao Luan, Qin Xian and Zhang Xian also entered the top 10. As the top 10 were finally determined, the first day of the competition also came to an end. Those who entered the top 10 would continue to compete in the top 10 finals the next day. Of course, being able to enter the top 10 had its own benefits. This benefit was that after entering the sword sect, they would be able to obtain various preferential treatment. They would be nurtured as core disciples by the sword sect and would be able to enjoy a certain degree of resources. After the announcement of the top 10, everyone was arranged to stay in the sword sect. As for the other disciples who didn't enter the top 10, they were directly accepted into the outer court of the sword sect. There was a special outer court deacon responsible for arranging their accommodations. Begging for collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations. Chapter 22-28. Those who ranked in the top 10 were naturally happy because this ranking would bring them a lot of benefits after joining the sword sect. After the first day of the ranking battles ended, Qin Xian invited Xiao Luan to tour the sword sect. Now that he was considered a new disciple of the sword sect, Qin Xian wanted to familiarize himself with the sword sect in the future. Xiao Luan didn't reject Qin Xian's invitation. Both of them strolled around the sword sect together. Xiao Luan was incomparably familiar with the sword sect. After all, she grew up in the sword sect and had been to many places. However, Xiao Luan didn't tell Qin Xian about this as she didn't want him to know her identity for the time being. Xiao Luan was clear that her identity would shock Qin Xian, which was why she chose to keep it a secret. However, as they walked side by side through the picturesque scenery of Swords Gate, they unknowingly arrived at the summit of one of the mountain peaks around Swords Gate. It was evening, and the sun was setting in the west. The blood-red sunset illuminated the surroundings beautifully. Qin Xian suddenly turned to Xiao Luan and said in a serious tone, "Xiao Luan, I like you." This was considered a straightforward confession. Qin Xian pondered for a long time before mustering the courage to say this. Xiao Luan was taken aback. This was the first time someone confessed to her and Xiao Luan was at a loss. Xiao Luan didn't hate Qin Xian, but it was far from liking him. Xiao Luan had always treated Qin Xian as a good friend and didn't have the slightest bit of romantic feelings for him. Qin Xian continued. "I've fallen in love with you since the first time I met you." "Xiao Luan, I'm sincere," Qin Xian blurted out his thoughts without any hesitation. He was afraid that he wouldn't have the courage to say these words in the future. But after hearing Qin Xian's words, Xiao Luan blushed and shook her head shyly. "I'm sorry, Xiao Luan wanted to reject Qin Xian." However, before Xiao Luan could speak, Qin Xian interrupted, "Don't say anything. Just give me a chance. Don't be in a hurry to reject me." It was Qin Xian's first time confessing to the woman he liked. At this moment, his heart was also in a mess. However, compared to this, Qin Xian wanted to let Xiao Luan know his feelings. At the same time, he was also afraid that Xiao Luan would reject him. Therefore, after speaking his mind, Qin Xian did not expect Xiao Luan to agree on the spot. He only hoped that Xiao Luan would give him a chance. Looking at Qin Xian's pleading face, Xiao Wan didn't know how to answer. In the end, he could only say, "I'll bring you to a place. You can make your decision then." Xiao Wan didn't have any romantic feelings for Qin Xian, but he didn't want to hurt Qin Xian either. After all, Qin Xian was his friend. Not knowing how to deal with this, Xiao Wan thought of her mother and immediately brought Qin Xian back to her home. Xiao Wan's home was naturally Xiao Chen's home. However, Qin Xian didn't know anything about this at this moment. As the sect master of the sword sect, Xiao Chen's residence was naturally the best in the sword sect. It also had the densest heaven and earth spiritual energy. Following Xiao Wan, Qin Xian arrived at the core area of the sword sect's main peak. Along the way, Qin Xian noticed something unusual. First, Xiao Wan seemed to be very familiar with the sword sect. Secondly, Xiao Wan was able to bring him through many areas guarded by the sword sect's disciples or areas protected by talisman arrays. Qin Xian already had a guess in his heart, so he probed, "Xiao Wan, is your family from the sword sect?" "You can say so." Xiao Wan nodded when he heard this. From Qin Xian's point of view, Xiao Wan's parents were probably some elders or deacons of the sword sect. This made sense. However, Qin Xian clearly didn't expect that Xiao Wan's parents weren't elders of the sword sect, but the sword sect's sect master, Xiao Chen. Under Xiao Wan's lead, the two quickly arrived at Xiao Chen's residence. After entering the residence, Qin Xian was simply stunned by the scene before him. The heaven and earth spiritual energy in the surroundings was extremely dense. It was comparable to the best cultivation secret realm in the Qin family, perhaps even surpassing it. Secondly, there was the fairyland-like environment in the cave, as well as the natural treasures that could be seen everywhere. Along the way, Qin Xian saw no less than 10 priceless treasures of heaven and earth. His eyes filled with shock, Qin Xian asked in disbelief, "Xiao Wan, is this really your home?" Hearing this, Xiao Wan turned to look at Qin Xian and said seriously, "Yes, let's go. I'll bring you to see my parents." Saying this, Xiao Wan brought Qin Xian to a bamboo garden. He knew that Xiao Chen must be here at this time. The environment was beautiful, surrounded by green bamboo. Under Xiao Wan's lead, Qin Xian quickly saw Xiao Chen in the bamboo forest. There was a simple wooden table and a praying mat. Dressed in white, Xiao Chen was sitting cross-legged on the praying mat, cultivating with his eyes closed. With the arrival of Xiao Wan and Qin Xian, Xiao Chen slowly opened his eyes. In fact, when Xiao Wan and Qin Xian had just entered the residence, Xiao Chen had already noticed Qin Xian, but he didn't stop him. Seeing Xiao Chen in front of him, Qin Xian was immediately stunned. He naturally knew who this handsome man was. As a young genius who wanted to enter the sword sect, Qin Xian had naturally seen Xiao Chen's portrait. Moreover, Qin Xian had always regarded Xiao Chen as his idol. He dreamed that one day, he would be able to personally see what kind of person his idol was. Now, his idol was only 10 meters away from him, but Qin Xian was so nervous that he couldn't even speak. What Xiao Wan said next shocked Qin Xian to the extreme. Xiao Wan happily ran to Xiao Chen and intimately hugged Xiao Chen's neck. She happily shouted, "I knew Daddy was here. You little girl, there are friends here. Don't you know how to be shy? Come down." Facing Xiao Wan's affectionate behavior, Xiao Chen affectionately scolded her. "Daddy." Listening to the conversation between the father and daughter, Qin Xian finally found out about Xiao Wan's family background. Xiao Wan and Xiao Chen were both surnamed Xiao. However, who would have thought that Xiao Wan's father was the sect master of the sword sect, one of the top heroes in the Great Thousand World, Xiao Chen? Qin Xian was completely shocked. He didn't even know what to do next. Fortunately, Xiao Wan spoke in time to help him out. "Daddy, this is my friend, Qin Xian. Begging for your collection, begging for monthly votes, begging for recommendations." End of chapter. You're tuning into the Mythic Realms YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.